is to wrap up our coverage of the book Mythos and Logos. We've spent almost a year on it, going through exploring the density of the language, especially the allusions to other philosophers and other philosophies, the way that he just will work in the entire body of work of Aquinas or Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or somebody else right into the middle of a sentence. And if you don't follow it up, then you don't actually know what he means by the words he's putting there. But you think you do, because you've seen these words before. You've just never seen this thing put together the way it is. Mythos and Logos is a book of basically email essays, informal essays from an email thread some years back, in which in these various essays he's exploring the idea that there are two major modes of culture for human beings that we're aware of: mythos culture and logos culture, and that they are fundamentally different from each other. They're organized according to different principles for different reasons. And it is very difficult for someone who has grown up in one of those modes to understand the other mode. They will tend to rewrite it to be some version of the mode they know, because what they've been taught is that the kind of culture that they're part of is the only culture that's possible. And everything else is just some primitive version of what we do now, and what we do now must be the most advanced and wonderful thing that's possible. This is particularly the impression that logos culture gives. We are hyper logos people. We grow up in a highly systematized civilization. Everything is mathematicized, measured, turned into laws and schemas and algorithms. And the belief is that if we can just eliminate all human qualities and script ourselves like little puppets obeying the algorithms, the precise mathematical algorithms of law and policy, then we will make a perfect world and everybody will be happy, or at least better than any alternative. That's what modernism says. It says, we've arrived, this is as good as it gets. So part of the purpose of this book, Mythos and Logos, is very contra-modern. He is trying to say that there is an alternative mode of culture, and it is so different from this one that it is actually difficult for us to comprehend what it is or how it works. And by difficult, I don't mean that we approximate it and get closer and closer. I mean, right out of the gate, we immediately turn it inside out into making it some form of logos culture. We can't envision what a mythos culture would be. We have been so immersed in this. So this is the purpose of this book. This book it was never originally put together as a book. That wasn't his intention. He didn't sit down to write a book called Mythos and Logos. David Rowell and I decided that we wanted to do, we decided this is one of the more interesting things that Kenneth Smith has in his philosophy, is this critique, this idea that there is this entire other mode, and that it is basically invisible and inconceivable to us, despite the fact that we know of people from history who have gone into it. So I'll call on you just a second, Peter, because I'm setting up today's session. That's going to include your part. So the idea is that, by exploring some of these essays, we can start to see some of the ideas that existed previously within mythos culture, and maybe start to get the ability to see the world a little bit from a mythos culture perspective, not because it's the right version, but because according to the fundamental principles of Kenneth Smith's philosophy, what we want is not to inhabit and solely inhabit any one philosophical or cultural perspective, but to gain the ability to see from multiple perspectives authentically in their own terms, so that our mind has more flexibility, so that we can get more perspectives on this infinite cosmos, despite the fact that we're finite creatures. So this series of essays culminates in Soul and Spirit and Ego, where he talks about the structure of, basically he's talking about the structure of Hegel's philosophy of Geist. When he uses spirit in the title of this, we can assume that what he's talking about there is the same Geist that he wrote the Phenomenology of Geist about. This is the equation that Kenneth Smith is making, and he aligns that with an und für sich sein, in and for itself, and with Vernunft, the mode of thought that combines the two basal modes of the metabolism. And the other two terms, soul and ego, corresponds in some ways, not directly, but correspond in some ways to the other two parts of this dialectical triad that Hegel sets up. So soul he is equating with gnosis, but particularly with naive gnosis as we're born into it, a state of immersion, what Hegel called Ansichtsein, in itself. This is being in itself. And the finitized form of Ansichtsein is Begriff. And that's when Ansichtsein, or soul, is turned back in on itself, closing itself off from the possibilities of the infinite and reducing everything down to its own parochial experience. The third mode, which is actually the second in the process of development, Vorsichtsein, for itself, being for itself, corresponds to Verstand. And that is, well, let's just say that Hegel spends a great deal of the phenomenology of Geist savaging Verstand, largely because we are, as a hyperlogos culture, we deify Verstand and we scapegoat Begriff as the source of all of our problems. All chaos, all badness comes from Begriff, we say. If only there's enough order and law and systematization and rationality, everything will be a utopia. This is the premise of modernism. And what Hegel said, is that that's not the case, that we have to transcend Begriff, we have to transcend Verstand, and we have to become adult human beings to fully use the capabilities that have evolved within us that make us human in the same way that the distinctive features of whales or elephants or leopards make them what they are. We have to grow beyond these two basal modes of the mind, of its metabolism, by reharnessing them together into Vernunft, which from our perspective as Verstand people is an alien mode of thought that is inconceivable. There can't be any Vernunft according to Verstand. There's only Verstand and then badness, which is Begriff, chaos, irrationality, emotionalism. All the bad things get shoved down into gnosis, and it gets blamed for all the world's problems. And all of the good things in the world are said to be the cause of education and systematization and rationality and reason, and basically Verstand is put on a pedestal and deified. So within this structure, the important things that I'm sort of going back to the beginning and just doing a quick sketch of the whole thing, because we're going to try to wrap this up today. Within this framework, logos culture is a product of Verstand, right? Verstand, the mode of thought, what we might call finitized noesis. Noesis turned back in on itself as a finitizing form of rationality that believes it is sufficient and complete. Verstand produces logos culture naturally as a result of the way that people envision the world, the way that they envision themselves, the way that they make plans for the relationship between themselves and the world, the way that they act with other people, aligning themselves with other Verstand people in order to put together strategies for how to make the world the way they want it. And in turn, it produces a form of civilization that is organized and structured according to reason and logic and systems and laws. And you end up with a logos culture. That's why you end up with a logos culture. And as you continue the process of scapegoating everything you do wrong, like holocausts and wars and so on, as you keep, or racism, as you keep blaming those things on emotionalism and primitivism and irrationality, all the things you say when you're furious with somebody, and you're yelling at them in an argument, trying to prove that they're bad and you're good, you say, you're just irrational, you're hysterical, which is, of course, an allusion to women, because there is patriarchy built into this. There is this whole sense that there are the bad things that are the cause of chaos and badness, and then there are the good things that are, if we could just be like Vulcans and make a perfect organized world, then nothing bad could happen. So that's logos culture, and it has enormous blind spots that Hegel's critiqued, Kierkegaard's critiqued, Nietzsche has critiqued, Hannah Arendt has critiqued, and Kenneth Smith critiques. And we don't like those critiques most of the time because we are raised within it, and we believe its value system. We believe that emotions are dangerous. Anger is a bad feeling, we think. We might allow there to be good feelings like love as long as they obey the laws and rules and stay in their frames that we set for them. But the other feelings are bad feelings: jealousy, rage, anger, hatred. We think those are, if only people didn't have those at all, we could make a perfect world of automatons who didn't feel anything and would just follow our perfect rules. And so what happens is that logos culture can't actually represent the full spectrum of a human being. It can't explain why we arrive at this point in our evolutionary history the way that we are. It seems like there's a bunch of blunders that evolution has made, and then there is this one good gift that we're going to try to use to make everything work out. And Hegel's critique and Kenneth Smith's critique is that this is a half-witted, cyclopean perspective on human nature and human history and human culture, that when we jettison gnosis and fully embrace noesis, the result is a cramped, limited, dicing, slicing, reductionist form of thinking and organization. It creates a mechanistic world order that can't satisfy us in the long run. And that in some ways it is an advancement because it is a purification of Verstand, turning it up to 11, getting everything out of it that it can. Yes, we can send people to the moon. Isn't that great? Yes, we can make a particle accelerator and so forth. But somehow we can't seem to solve even the most fundamental problems in our own society, like homelessness, like violence against people, like rape. Why do these things keep happening? Well, they're all in the blind spot of logos culture. It says, well, if we just need to make more rules, we just need more police officers, we need to hit more people over the head to make them comply with the rules, and then it will all work out perfectly. It's unable to express the full spectrum of human experience, human emotion, and human culture. And so this book, without ever trying to lay out anything like a utopian, recipe for human beings, without ever even in any detail specking out how mythos culture works, what it does is just make the argument that there has been this other mode of culture, despite the fact that we can't see it, and that it did operate fundamentally differently than logos culture does. And it, in the same way that he has traced through these connections between noesis, Verstand, logos culture, and the kinds of, and modernism, he also traces through the connections between gnosis and begriff, soul and spirit, this immersive side of life in which, rather than always having to be the active eco, we allow ourselves to submit to the natural laws of the cosmos rather than trying endlessly to impose our own laws, that we acknowledge that we dream, we acknowledge that we feel, we acknowledge that these things are there for a reason, and that they could be organized into a healthy life if we weren't constantly scapegoating and trying to stamp them out and, keep them in their place. And that, in fact, people have done so in the past. And they may not have done so perfectly, they may have had plenty of problems of their own, but that there's a lot to be learned if we can learn to see those cultures not as primitive logos cultures, but as either complete or partial mythos cultures that contain evidence of another path, another way that we could go. Again, this also doesn't argue that these are the only two paths that are possible. This isn't a fundamentally dualist schema. What this is saying is, out of the dialectic of the phenomenology of Geist, which was drawn upon subsequently by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Arendt and others, we can at least project this much. And if we can project one severely different alternative to what's going on now, then it also opens up the possibility that there could be a lot more that just are even more inconceivable to us because of how stuck we are in our labyrinth. So in Soul and Spirit and Ego, we've gone through all the sections except for the final one, Spirit and Soul, Yang and Yin. And so my plan for today is to wrap that up. We now, having gone through the rest of this book, we have the terminology, we have the framework to understand most of what he's talking about here. It should be fairly straightforward. And since it's straightforward, that means we can set aside some time for something else. And what I'm hoping to set aside time for, what do you think, Peter? A half hour? Is that what you wanted? Yes. I'd like to, I'm going to call on Peter in just a sec before I call on Phil. We'd like to set aside the final half hour of today's class. And what Peter wants to bring in is some of the non-dualistic possibilities that we're alluding to here, that he has explored in other philosophers and in other writings, just to help underscore this idea that what we're doing here is not trying to say that Kenneth Smith is a dualist imposing dualism. We're trying to say he's trying to open the door and say that he's not a monist. There's more than logos culture as possibilities. Mythos culture just opens the door for us to begin seeing what some of these other things are. And my hope is that what Peter's going to give us by kind of expanding our range of discussion, sets us up for the discussions to come in future weeks when we start into other books talking about broader subjects than just this kind of severely cramped one. Before we get going, Peter, do you want to expand on? You're going to get the full half hour at the end, but do you want to expand right now just to give people a sense of kind of what we're talking about doing?
Yes, so pretty much in the 30 minutes, I'm going to share with the group 3 videos, and in that give different arguments to connect them and how they connect to Kenneth Smith's writings and the discussion so far in this group. I guess first, let me know when you would like me to start.
Yeah, so I don't know which time zone you're in. In my time zone, it's 11:19, and these classes go until 2. And what I want to do is well, seminars, they're not classes. So what I want to do is shortly before 1:30, probably starting around 1:15, knowing how the lines of questions usually go. We'll start trying to wrap up the discussion of this chapter so that by 1:30 you can get a clean start and get your full half hour in. Does that sound like a plan?
All right, so you want me to start at the end? Okay.
Yeah, because it makes a nice jumping off from this book into the broader experience of.
Sure.
Okay, very good. Phil, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, you sort of heal up what I was comment on at the end, and I think Peter is going to expand upon that. I'm glad about that because but unfortunately, you almost said it as an addendum. What I was gonna mention was my criticism is that yes, he is criticizing, the one logos culture, but unfortunately, almost everything he has to say has to do with Western civilization. And it seems to me, if you want more diversity, there's many more other possibilities than that. And so I'm glad that Peter will say something about that. That's all I want to say for now. I'll probably have some other things to say.
Thank you for that, Phil. Yeah, there's a way in which, although Kenneth is very interested in alternative philosophical traditions, he's only going so far in them. And you can see the way he's going to pull on yin and yang. You can see he's talking about some introductory stuff, but I haven't read a book of his that does a deep dive into any tradition other than the Western. And of course, Asia is not any more monolithic than anything else. There are enormous numbers of different philosophical traditions. We had that one week when we did the deep dive, sort of the introductory, overview of just even some of the history of different philosophical traditions in China, and their different conceptions of yin and yang and the different diagrams and so forth that we went through. But even beyond that, all the different countries have their own traditions. India is like a culture factory, just massively fountaining out religions and philosophies and perspectives and ideas. You could spend more than a lifetime just trying to summarize everything that came out of there. And that's even before we get into Africa and Australia and North and South America and so forth. So there is enormous scope to go into. And it's part of what I like about Kenneth Smith's approach to philosophy is that he's not trying to promulgate a complete inclusive system. He knows that he is just one finite person who has only spent a certain amount of time looking at philosophy. And his main job that he's trying to do is to follow up on Kafka's comment that a book should be an ice axe to break up the frozen sea within us, just to make it possible for us to begin looking around and going, why was I ever so blinkered and blinded? There's so many possibilities that I need to explore, to do justice to the infinitude of life. Peter, go ahead.
And I suppose on that note, I do want to introduce just one quote from my opening of a presentation that I think would be very rich for this level of summing up Kenneth Smith, and that is the opening quote from Julian Jaynes' book, The Origin of Consciousness, the breakdown of the bicameral mind, that I haven't read completely. It's not to say that it represents my view, but the opening line I view is very succulent and relevant. And that is, when asked what is consciousness, we become conscious of consciousness. And most of us take this consciousness of consciousness to be what consciousness is. This is not true. And I feel that really summarizes the approach to gnosis, this idea that if we understand it correctly, we'll connect to it. And
Yes.
therein lies what I would say is the folly, in my opinion, with all due respect to Kenneth Smith, his methodology of getting people familiar with it is through an understanding, where I would personally argue understanding, although might be complementary, at normal, it ends up being irrelevant, and at worst, an impediment. And so all of these attempts to try to build relationship through understanding is going exactly the wrong way, because it is not some type of, or slightly altering your mind to grasp it correctly. That in of itself will never lead to it, ever. And therein lies, I would say, this common enlightenment based approach of which Kenneth Smith is carrying on that torch in order to look at the limitations, as you mentioned about Kafka, breaking up the ice. That often is important enough in order to convince the mind there's merit beyond it. But
Right.
to describe the door and the merit of the door does not necessarily mean going through it.
Right.
Because I would say that gnosis is more of a doing and an
Yes.
engaging than
Yes.
an understanding. And
Yes.
I part my presentation would be sharing the difference between them, and that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure Kenneth would agree with you that the belief that we can sum everything up through understanding is a very verstant noetic perspective. And it puts us right back into the problem that modernism and logos culture are presenting to us, which is a disengagement from, an alienation from the actual experience of the world. And that to engage in gnosis means to engage in praxis. It must involve action, so that the actions give you a completely different lever, to lever out the blockages in your brain. You can only do so much by talking. And it's the framework of these meetups that we get together and talk, which, is a noetic logos thing to do. So, I'm gonna celebrate your critique, and I think Kenneth would too. So why don't we call on Stephen and then Phil? Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to make a reference again to that crisis in the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, whatever you like to call it, where the Western Church tossed out the trichotomy of man, of body, soul, and spirit.
Right.
In contradiction to the Orthodox Church, which, well, the Church of Constantinople, which retained it. And I remember, this is going back, 43 years, I was sitting in circles discussing this question, that it seemed to be that the church reached a point at that time where they could no longer understand what spirit was. They could no longer distinguish between soul and spirit. But in reference, you can read their tractates on these things, and you come up with things that what the soul is defined as certain conscious abilities. The soul is sentience, the ability to be conscious of feeling. The soul is rationality, the ability to be conscious of thought. But Peter's introducing the other concept, and I don't know if it has a technical term, so here's my question. So is there a technical term for consciousness of consciousness? This would be the third power after the other two of the soul.
In the schema that you're describing that was used then, yeah. And this is our problem, is that not only is there not a completely agreed upon term for that, all the other terms you've said, we have the same problem. All different groups mean different things by them. And often the exact same person means different things by the term based on different contexts, or different days when they woke up and forgot what they said yesterday and they say something new today. Soul and spirit, consciousness, intellect, reason, all these things are just, in the modern world, they're a big muddle, because they're verstant attempting to describe itself without any context other than itself, and attempting to describe other things that can't be explained from its own perspective. And so in the same way, you sort of see this I talk a lot about the scapegoating role. Verstand needs Begriff to exist so that Begriff can be the recipient of all blame for everything that Verstand does wrong. We say, despite the fact that the Holocaust was the most systematically organized genocide in the history of the world, with computers and numbers and calculations, IBM rose to prominence selling computers to the Nazis. Most Americans don't know that the numbers that were stamped on Jews were the numbers that were entered into the IBM database so that they could be put into the computer. I mean, the whole computer industry, has got blood on its hands from its very foundations because of this. This idea that what happened with the Holocaust was an example of hyper-rationality is not the way we teach it, because that is heresy to us. To us, hyper-rationality can only lead to good things. And so therefore, we always say that, well, it must be that it wouldn't have happened if it weren't for, emotional bigotry. Just raw hatred and rage must have been, emotions, those icky things. They must have been the cause. But none of that can explain, well, then what was the role of computers? And what were the role of these numbers and all the trains that had to run on time to move certain numbers of Jews to a death camp on a certain schedule? I mean, it was a massively scheduled, organized operation. That is not a deeply emotionalist, immersive, experiential, you can't blame that side of the mind for doing those things. The side of the mind that's capable of doing those things is the one that's busy trying to blame the other side for everything that it did. And so there is this way in which we can't be honest with ourselves as moderns, even about the things we're most proud of, because we have to lie about them in order to exempt them from responsibility for the consequences of using those faculties. And so, in this way, Verstand can't even be honest about Verstand. It's lying even about the thing it's most familiar with, in order to promulgate the value system, which is Verstand is all good and Begriff is all bad, and the source of all things, of all problems. I think it's Phil and then Peter. Is that right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Phil.
I like what Peter said about understanding. My understanding of understanding is that it is a minor form of consciousness. In other words, understanding understands, but what it understands is within the structure of the rules themselves, right? So therefore, right away is a subordinate mental faculty. My simple answer is like, you can understand all the rules of baseball, the infield fly rule, 3 strikes you out, like all those things. But that is different from praxis. Like, but why do you want to play baseball?
Right.
I mean, yeah, I understand. Okay. Yeah, but I don't want to play this, right? So therefore, it's like, I guess they could say, well, then you're a fool. I mean, I suppose they could say that, but it has nothing to do with what I actually want to do. So that's the nature of understanding to me. Very limited, but important, but very limited.
Yeah. And, this is part of Kenneth Smith's critique of modernism, is that for all that we say we are the most objective, most educated people who have ever existed, it is not a coincidence that all the most fundamental terms required to understand our own minds and our own behavior and our own culture are all the most muddied terms. It's not random which things we're vague and confused about, and yet think that we're not, right? So we have all these precise terms we can use for all kinds of things having to do with, firing rockets, dropping bombs, mixing chemical mixtures, in which there's really no ambiguity. I mean, there is as little ambiguity as we can conceive of in any of those things. But the moment you try to use the word think or rationality or consciousness, it all just becomes this muddle. And it's part of why we can all sit down at a conversation like this and all have different definitions of these things, while simultaneously thinking we have the same definition and that we're communicating with each other. And a big part of what Kenneth Smith's trying to do in his philosophy is say, why don't we draw off of these rigorous terms that have been developed by the people who have thought the longest about it and written the most about it as one of the frameworks we should have handy in addition to all the other frameworks? Because as long as we're stuck with English, we're never going to communicate about these things. It's always going to be muck and muddle and confusion. But we could use these Hegelian, Kierkegaardian, Arendtian terms to translate into and out of. And so then at least if we have a difference in understanding about what consciousness is, we can figure out what it is. But when we start trying to compare what we mean by consciousness to these terms that Hegel uses, then we can say, oh, you're lining up consciousness with Vernunft, whereas I was lining it up with Verstand. So really we're talking about two different things, right? Without that frame of reference, we're so muddled, we can't even figure out what the muddle is. And, part of what's interesting about this is that, Hegel's take on spirit is different from the medieval one because he is giving it structure, and not just mechanical structure, he's giving it dynamic structure. These two parts of the basal metabolism of the mind, how they relate to an experience of life, and why animals have what they have and why people have what they have and why each of these things manifests the way it does. He shows how and why spirit develops out of the other two and when it doesn't, and when it turns back on itself and becomes self-limiting. So part of what's at the core of this is Hegel wrote all of this and developed all of this in response to Kant. And he said there's really a couple of problems with Kant. And one problem with Kant is that Kant only makes sense if all human beings work according to a particular model of personality that we don't actually find in any human beings. And if the people who we find who approximate it the most are not the way we start out in life. They're like, you have to be highly trained to become a very noetic person of the kind that for which Kant's epistemology and axiology would make sense. And the problem is if most people don't actually fit that model, and if nobody starts out with that model, what we have here is something completely out of context that we can't figure out how to apply it to the majority of cases. And so he said, his summation was that Kant is like the medieval peasant who doesn't want to get into the water until he's already mastered swimming. And the problem is you can't master swimming without getting in the water. This goes to Peter's thing about the difference between trying to understand your way to success versus recognizing the immersive quality that's required to wrestle with reality so that it can teach you the things that you can't learn by sitting at a philosophy seminar or a Zoom session like this and just talking about it, right? The praxis side is at least half of everything, according to Hegel, and it's what's missing from Kant's critique of the structure of the mind. And therefore, this is what Kenneth Smith is bringing to it as well. Despite the fact that he's coming as a philosophy professor and a philosophy writer, he says over and over and over that Verstand approach to life, we'll just try to understand our way to success, is not going to work. It is in fact using the very tool that has built the labyrinth that we're trapped in. It is exactly the kind of thinking that Daedalus engaged in when he built a labyrinth so sophisticated it could defeat his own mind, and then realized he couldn't get out of it, and he was its first prisoner. This is what happens when we try to use understanding to make sense out of the world, strictly understanding to make sense out of the world. We're never going to get there where we have to go. We need an entirely different dimension. In the same way he had to go to the third dimension and fly out of the labyrinth because all of the frameworks within which the labyrinth were expressed left no way out. In the same way, the modes of thinking that we're using to try to understand our lives and our situation are also the trap extending itself beyond our ability to get out until we break free into a new direction. Peter, go ahead.
Where should I go? Pretty much there is a critique I do want to make of Kenneth Smith, but maybe now is not the right time in context to what you were saying. But of the initial point I wanted to make, I suppose, was something that'd be more easily understood. This idea of, the Descartes being one of the great founders of the Enlightenment movement, and his whole "I think, therefore I am," and that being the priority nature of that orientation of what the self is.
Yes.
And relating that to his taking his wife's dog and skinning and operating it alive because he believes that animals don't have souls. And just to put, I want you to put yourself in his shoes, doing that to a pet and spending a few hours as it's whining in agony, and not feeling much of anything.
Right.
Or feeling some type of sadism, either way. That was his mind.
Yeah.
We based much of these ideas on his,
Right.
that foundation. What was missing in him in regards to at least what we may ourselves value.
Yeah.
And that thread, that cornerstone of these traditions being Descartes. I just want people to feel that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And you see it again in the 20th century with Skinner's behaviorism, but even more with the school of behaviorism that extended beyond Skinner. Skinner warned that you can't use operant conditioning strictly on a human being because human beings' minds are too clever. They'll figure out that it's not that life is rewarding and punishing me, it's that you are, you asshole. And if I just kick your ass, the punishments go away, right? People can think outside the box. And so Skinner said, there's limits to behaviorism. You shouldn't take it too far. But some of his disciples said, oh, he was just timid. We're going to take it all the way. And so that's when you get into this nonsense where they start arguing that animals don't have feelings again in the 20th century, advocating for all kinds of cruelty, and where they then extend it further, which is the natural consequence of beginning that road, which is, well, then maybe people don't have thoughts or feelings anyway, and they're just machines, and we should just manipulate them in a behaviorist fashion. And what we find in the second half of the 20th century in particular is that turned into the basis for mutually assured destruction as a strategy to avoid nuclear annihilation. Richard Lamb, hasn't been here for a few months. He's got I think a job that collides with our schedule. But he introduced us to a series of documentaries called The Trap by, I think it's Adam Curtis is the name of the documentarian. You can find them on YouTube. And he explores in those the ways in which that desire to ignore the contents of a human being and model them as a kind of machine that has enlightened self-interest and is constantly aware of everything it needs to know in order to maximize return on investment for itself. And that could be a basis for a civilization, sort of an empty human being who just acts, but has no feelings. This was just the extension of what Peter's describing, this Cartesian concept which he applied to animals and which later was being applied to human beings, that there's nothing worth knowing inside, no values need to be important. We'll just organize society according to their competitive struggle to each achieve what they want to achieve. And somehow through the invisible hand of the market, goodness will follow and we will end up with a perfect civilization. Peter, go ahead.
I just want to preemptively clarify based on an argument that may not be said, but I still want to, that during the medieval period and early Enlightenment period, of course, there was a lot of operating on live animals in order to better understand biology. And, so why I'm clarifying what made Descartes unique in that is that a lot of these ideas were more relating to the end justified the means in regards to a necessary sacrifice, where Descartes did it for his own curiosity.
Right. He wanted to know, and that was more important than the idea that the animal had any rights worth paying attention to. I first consciously got into philosophy as a teenager, and even at that young age, I could see the flaw in Descartes' cogito ergo sum, which is, how do you know you're the one thinking? You might not be. Trying to make the foundation of human consciousness be the thinking part was a fallacy, because what seems to be the foundation is the experience of thinking. You are aware of yourself, you feel yourself thinking, and you believe that you're thinking. But it could be somebody else doing all the thinking and you're just merging with that experience. And so I could see there was this missing thing that I would later call gnosis. I could see there was this missing component that's at the bottom foundation of human experience, at least as much as the ability to think is. And that there was something weird going on with Descartes when he excluded that and said, oh no, the thinking is the bottom. You can derive everything from the thinking. It's like, well, that can't be right, because it itself also has this thing. So at any rate, we've I think at this point we've sort of kind of introduced the topic. And so what we can do is look at 7.7 and work our way through the text. We should be able to get all the way through it today. and wrap up. What we find in at the beginning of 7.7 is Joshua Stevens is being quoted. This is the part that Kenneth is responding to in 7.7, where he's talking about, not quite grokking what Kenneth is talking about with soul and spirit, and that he would like some help sort of tangling out what Kenneth is referring to. And he takes a stab at it and tries to turn it into a dualistic approach of the soul being the passive downward path of energy and the spirit being the active upward path of energy. And I did not understand what Kenneth had written here when I first read it all those years ago, because Kenneth doesn't start out by making a clear distinction between what Joshua said and what Kenneth means. He starts out by seeming to just agree with him that there's this dualism between soul and spirit. But nothing that he said in the previous parts of this essay or the previous parts, or indeed in the rest of what he's about to write, would confirm that, right? The idea that soul and spirit are two fundamental things in opposition to each other is not, in fact, a Kenneth Smith reading, despite a sentence or two in here where he sort of says you're on the right path, because his reading is the dialectical one of Hegel, in which the relationship is that soul is one of the two basal metabolic functions of the mind, and the other one is ego. And it is only when soul and ego are uncoiled from their finitized form into a finitized form, capable of expanding consciousness to embrace a larger world, both a larger world of experiences and a larger world of ideas. Only when you bring them together and harness them to the world do you get spirit. Spirit doesn't have a direct, simple relationship to soul. Soul is gnosis, and especially gnosis in its begriff form, but also gnosis in its uncoiled form that allows it to reach up to Vernunft. Spirit is only when gnosis uncoils to the level of Vernunft, but also ego uncoils to the level of Vernunft, and they come together to form the Vernunft. Only that is spirit in this Hegelian model of soul and spirit. And he doesn't initially spell that out in his very first response. He talks about the feminine and the masculine and the Apollonian and Dionysian to try to underscore the dualism that Joshua has brought up. But it's then in the paragraph that follows where he breaks that down. You see where he says, there should be neither crude domination nor crude submission, where two become or recognize that they already essentially are not one and not two. This same formula, let me stop this phone. This same formula by which Buddhists so anti-rationalistically and anti-banalsically describe the relation between soul and body also applies to the relation between lover and lover, parent and child, member and community. So this is, you guys, yes, it takes both to make the whole. Buddhism says soul and body are not one, not two. That's a famous Buddhist quote. And it's talking about the problem with trying to reduce things to an alienative dualism in which you have two choices and you have to pick one or the other and they're in opposition to each other. And the Buddhists say, well, no, you can't understand the human body without understanding the human soul, and you can't understand the human soul without understanding the human body, because they are intertwined with each other and they inform each other and they create a larger whole out of each other. So there's a dialectical relationship that in the second paragraph, he's trying to bring to the forefront in opposition to the simple dualism of Joshua's question. But where it really kicks off is in the third and fourth paragraphs. This is where he brings in Hegel in order to resolve the question. Well, if they're not one and they're not two, if there's some kind of dualism, but it's not a trivial mechanical dualism, then what are we talking about? And what we're talking about is the dialectic, that we're forming a greater whole out of things that are in opposition to each other. And that the things that are in opposition to each other aren't just two randomly selected things, but the second grows out of the first into opposition, that it's in some ways an extension of it or a part of it, like the bud and the blossom, and that they grow through to become the fruit, which is yet a third mode. And that this basically destroys all the simple dualisms that we might read this as, and tries to take us beyond to a concept of an energetic world full of dynamism and transformation, a Heraclitean world, which is what Hegel built his philosophy based on, in which he breaks down the trivial dualities of Western civilization to say, oh no, it's so much more interesting than that. So, all right, Phil and then Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me it kind of begins. He didn't mention this with I think it's Locke who says tabula rasa,
Right.
because he assigned the fact that the soul and the spirit is not blank to begin with. Soul is connected to life.
Yes.
And spirit is connected to culture. And to me, that's where it begins. And I got this idea, the real beginning is with Nietzsche. Spirit is the life that cuts into life.
Yes.
And that immediately reminded me of Artemis, where, as an artist, where the bow and the lyre becomes a kind of, how should I say, a kind of spiritual hunt in which Artemis spots the deer.
Yes.
And uses the lyre to hunt the deer and, in a sense, kill it, cuts into life in order to expose life. And
Yes.
I thought that was kind of interesting because there was a mystery in it that as soon as you kill the deer in this way, it is, in a sense, the revealing that it made in the forest suddenly disappear, because so there's a covering over as well. So in a sense, and the difference between that is a very careful and in a sense a kind of metaphorical spiritual uncovering of the relationship that could continue into spirit and inform culture. And I think it's important to note, and I think he continues on to note, that if you're not careful in using the bow and the lyre, then it becomes the bow and the arrow.
Right.
That's ours, and it leads very quickly in the war,
Yes.
rather than an addition, a surplus that leaks into culture. I thought that was wonderful. It's not quite exactly what he said, but that's what I interpreted. And I think that refers then back to Hegel about how culture is such an important part of the equation, because it's seeping deep into the soul in order to capture it and to bring it into the spirit world of culture. But neither of them were blank tablets to begin with.
That's right.
I mean, that's an important part, because there was already a tension that existed, but it's a question of bringing it up and making it appear in the world as something that's active.
Yes.
That's from an artist's point of view of interpreting that, but nonetheless, I think it has a lot to do with what he was saying.
Well, it's directly relevant because he's an artist too. He thinks in these terms. All the mythology, all of the attempts to capture the juices of life and passion, are core to this approach. He read Nietzsche not as a way to be cool and edgy, but as a vitalist who was critiquing the anemic, overly rationalist philosophies of his day, and trying to say, how do we put the life back into philosophy? How do we put the practice back in? What is the missing part that just dies away when philosophy is reduced to an academic discipline? What is the rest of the picture?
It also recalled to me that you have to be careful in the praxis, because it reminded me quickly about the whole idea of bloodletting as the balance of the humors. I mean, which is in a sense not a metaphor that spills into culture, but actually spills into life. I mean, the real life itself. So the contrast between bloodletting as the balance versus Artemis as the huntress as the artist that hunts.
Yeah.
It's a very, very important distinction.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, and linking Artemis to the dialectic is interesting because, of course, Hegel says he got the dialectic from Heraclitus, and Heraclitus's lines that are most clearly about the dialectic, as you say, talk about the bow and the lyre, and the way that the forces are not just in opposition but harnessed to each other to create a dynamism that's capable of propelling an arrow or plucking a musical note, and that it's impossible to explain either the flight of the arrow or the musical notes unless you understand the dialectic. If you don't know how the forces have been harnessed together into a living system, then the note just seems like magic, and the flight of the arrow seems like magic. And in the same way, even under modernism, despite all our attempts to squeeze all the magic out of everything and turn it to a machine, we still don't explain life very well in biology. We start with the cell. And the reason we start with the cell is we don't really want to have to talk about, well, how did we get from not alive to alive? Where in our vision of a dead universe that's a machine, how did we cross the threshold to a living cell? Where did that ever happen? And Heraclitus and Hegel can explain it because they see the dynamism that's involved in everything. They see the way that forces can be pulled together so that if you get too far out of bounds either direction, one or the other force pulls you back into the living zone. But I'm gonna explicate this a little more after I call on Peter, because Peter's got something he wants to add. But I really like your tying of Artemis. And of course, for anyone who missed the reference, part of why Artemis is such a great choice here is that what Heraclitus did after he reluctantly agreed to write his book was he deposited at the great temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the world in Ephesus, where he lived. So he thought there was an immediate direct connection between his philosophy and Artemis. He did not deposit it at a temple of Apollo, for example, which we might imagine as rationalists, we might imagine, well, that must be where it'd go, right? Enlightenment. It's like, no. We're going to talk about nature and life. Go ahead, Peter.
First, and to respond to that, Artemis is a moon goddess. She was able to navigate the deep forests in the great dark and to hunt after what she was looking for. She normally was the goddess of young women coming into puberty. Those were the festivals associated with her of coming into womanhood.
Right.
And so, but aside that, the 2 ideas that I want to expand upon of what you said before. One is this idea of the third. And I believe that one sort of confusing term is this idea of non-dual, which really just means not two. And I feel that so much of philosophy is caught up conceptually with 0, 1, and 2.
Yes.
And they forget any other number, the 3, the 4, the 5, the 6, the 7, the 8,
yes.
all. And there are many different systems that philosophy cannot entertain because it's not dealing with the 1 or the 2.
Yes.
And so it is that idea of what is when the mother and the father create the child. Who is the child?
Right.
That, I believe, is the sort of that living spirit of when they come together.
Yes.
That metaphor is as ancient as time, but it's forgotten.
Yes.
Because, it's all about, well, that sense of, I believe that, if you have a mind that in the pursuit of truth distills everything in a dualistic fashion, this idea of everything, that's what fundamentally is. It's either one or the other. I believe that, it is only when you start entertaining gray as not being black or white, then you can start entertaining color.
Right.
But therein lies that reductionism of the intellect. And part of the conditioning of the intellect to be open to be less harmful.
Yes.
Is to start entertaining conceptualizations that don't boil down to 2. That's why Pythagoras always, I really want to underline this, Pythagorean thought and philosophy all throughout the ages valued the odd number because it doesn't boil down.
Right.
3, 5, 7, all of these numbers, you can't boil down the 2.
Right.
So therein lies their fundamental stability as conceptual systems.
Mhm.
The intellect can't break it down more.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I think is very missing in this discussion of trying to figure out, well, what's the way out of non-two?
Right.
And what's non-dualism? When people think of non-dualism, they often think of 1 or 0.
Right.
And
right.
they don't, but that's so in this numerological paradigm of how that relates to categorization, of trying to group things together, that natural process is of that domineering process. I think is often the language is not prepared to entertain these lines of thought, because the ideas of where these come from are too esoteric to be considered. I mean, I'll stop with one more comment. I mean, part of the question of which you asked me before in regards to my argument that there are plenty of authors that have explained better than Kenneth Smith. The issue that I had is that so much of those authors include jargon that are so far removed from what we're talking about now that it'd be near impossible it's a whole different language.
Right. Right. Which is fine as long as we're doing the Smithian thing of attempting to add new perspectives that make us look at the world differently. It's not okay if we're trying to make a single unified system that is the answer to all questions, because then everything has to be harmonized, and then it's a problem that the words don't agree with each other. But if we can acknowledge, but if we can acknowledge that any human perspective is necessarily finite and therefore limited in its ability to describe the world, then it's okay for each one to set up its own framework for, what is this perspective about, and how does it look at things, and then it then yields very fruitful discussions that can follow to say, once we've learned the one system in its own terms, once we've learned the other system in its own terms, then we can start talking about comparing and contrasting the terms in terms of the two different systems to figure out how do they really relate to each other.
And if you don't mind my responding, I do believe that in my own, I may fail at expressing this articulately and with brevity, but of this idea of Kenneth Smith's, I appreciate, and I really want to apologize for my conduct last time I was here. I was passionate, but I wasn't being nearly as respectful as I could be, and I just want to apologize to the group for that.
You're allowed to be enthusiastic. We all are.
Appreciate. So pretty much one of my major frustrations, let's say, of Kenneth Smith is the merit and his argument for using this redefining, for clarity's sake, soul and spirit. My issue is, even though there's potential merit for that, I do not see him making use of it. Now, that's not the crux of it. The crux of my issue is his conflation that all of these authors for over 2,000 years that they're all saying this, using the terms in the same way. He's creating a monomyth. No. I'm not saying he said that. I'm not saying he says that. But his clarity of trying to build arguments based on defining these two terms in a relationship with each other is in itself a false dualism. Now, I'm not saying he's not aware of it. I'm not saying he's not aware of it. I'm not saying he doesn't caution against it.
Right.
But the whole point of redefining or clarifying terminology is to use that as a base for further pointage. And where I personally, granted, there's a lot of, I do not see him making use of that, because I feel that the costs of doing that for the sake of building an argument, the potential cost is that you then look at these ancient writers and look at their coinage through the terminology of how Kenneth Smith explained it, of which each of these different writers, whether great or small in nuance of difference, it's suggesting that terms have their own meaning as opposed to how the individual author is trying to express with and through them. And I feel that does a disservice to his point. It may be a necessary sacrifice, of which I do appreciate. However, I do not see that sacrificing having much fruit based on my image of how you represent his ideas in these groups. Now, I'm horribly ignorant about his potential, but in regards to, I trust you to represent Ken. And there's no way that you're going to convince me otherwise, because I do believe that, it's not an issue of the keenness of your mind, and you've studied him to the nth degree compared to probably most anyone else. So in regards to going back to my fundamental issue with him, using this summarization of clarifying these terms doesn't lead to anything but this appeal, this appeal to mysticism, this appeal to gnosis, without explaining how or getting there himself. Now, I'm not saying that he's not necessarily there, but I currently see no evidence. It seems like he's a fanboy of the mythos. He's a worshiper of it, of which I greatly appreciate. He's done a lot of work and effort. But when it comes down to going through the door, as someone who's studied him deeply, I mean, I do think that that going into, when I explain doing as opposed to knowing, that Rick, of how you sort of related to the word doing was very different than how I was meaning it. It's not to say doing cannot be through language, but I'll stop there because I'll get more into it in my presentation. Yeah,
and there's a couple of things, and one is, it's good that you wrestle with this stuff. It's, he's not looking for followers. He's pretty much a hermit at this point. He and his approach to philosophy, like that of the other existentialists he draws on, is muscular. He likes the wrestling process, and he likes it if people wrestle with what he's saying. And that doesn't mean they wrestle and submit. That means they wrestle with it. They think about what's meaningful to them and what they've read before, and they wrestle with whether they like what he's saying or whether it makes sense to them, whether the terms are right, whether this is what he wants. He's trying to get people to be a whole lot less complacent, and it doesn't have to result in agreement. Just the process of the wrestling itself is philosophy. At a fundamental level, the willingness to compare incompatible worldviews and try to critique them in terms of each other is what the whole point is in what Kenneth's doing here. He's trying to point his way to that stuff. So, but I think the main caution, the only real caution I have for you, is that what we've been talking about is one book that was never written to be a book. We're basically talking about 7 email extracts, and which you can blame David and I for putting those together and calling it a book. When I first told Kenneth that we were making a book out of it, he was surprised. He was like, "Really?" Like, "Yeah, we want to talk about mythos and logos culture, and you don't have a book about that, and this is what we could find." He's like, "Oh, all right." So what you're going to find is that in other books he's going to focus and emphasize on different things, and part of what I'm hearing and enjoying in your critique is that you are interested but impatient. You feel like he should have gone further. And the good news is he has other books and essays where he goes further. This is just some things. This is just some of his stuff. But I will agree with you that he doesn't claim to be complete or to have hit all of the zones or to have gone all the places he should go. And if I think I said this last week, or the week before last, and I want to repeat it again since this is probably our final session on Mythos and Logos, which is that his critique of Hannah Arendt is that she made astonishing contributions to 20th century philosophy. She's one of the only 20th century philosophers. He's got a very short list of 20th century philosophers who he feels bucked the trend of academicism to really wrestle with the meaty subjects, and he thinks she's one of them. And he says the frustration he has with Hannah Arendt is that she draws off this excellent tradition, she puts it together in a new and insightful way, and then she walks right up to revolutionary insights and then doesn't say them. But everything about her line of argument points to a conclusion that she holds off on. And he says the thing about her that's frustrating for him is why wouldn't she say the big explosive insight that her whole line of argument goes to? You know, is it because she was a woman in a male-dominated discipline, and that she felt she could only go so far and be justified, or they would attack her? Was it, you know, it could be any number of reasons, but he doesn't know why. But he says, you know, there's this. This is one of his. He has this affection and frustration with her. So, if your conclusion upon reading Kenneth Smith is effectively the same thing, that he pulls together these meaty terms, he points in the direction of important things, but then he doesn't go through the door and get beyond the you know, into the rich areas that you want to go to, then I have to say that is not only a fair critique, it is in some sense earned by the guy who had that exact same critique for Hannah Arendt. There is a certain symmetry and justice to it. And we can see whether in the other books that we go through, whether you know would agree that he didn't go any further. But if he didn't, it's a legit criticism. In some ways, you're turning Kenneth Smith's critique of Hannah Arendt against himself, and he would laugh. He would chuckle. He'd say, "Well, yep, hoist on my own petard, right?" So you're probably expecting a lot of pushback, and you might be confused that you're not getting it, because you know, yeah, this the whole point of this is to push further than we've gone before, and to see in new ways. Stephen and then Phil, go ahead. Oh, and then Donald. So Stephen, Phil, Donald. Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to bring back the perspective. How can we trust reason?
Yes.
Is the human CPU full of holes?
Yes.
That's a question. This is a question Nietzsche raised in The Madman. People don't seem to notice it. When he came along and said, God is dead, and the crowd's just sitting there, yeah, so what? They know what he means. He means God is dead, but they haven't grasped the implications.
Yes.
Nietzsche's pointing out that the religion gave you certain guarantees of existence, that the reason in your head wasn't an accident, that existence wasn't an accident. That's the whole idea of Darwinian evolution. Yeah. We are an accident. So you guys, if God is dead, you're all standing around thinking you're having a good time, but you're all accidents. You could even be mistakes.
Right.
Where's the certainty in that?
Right.
And I'm always a bit worried when everybody's treating reason like a god that's infallible.
Yes.
Because what's reason? Is it human reason? Is it universal reason? Is it the reason of a dog? Because they can be all different.
Yes. You know, the metaphor here, although we'll have to go beyond it as well, is of the Great Space Telescope. Is it Hubble, the Great Hubble Space Telescope, that only when they got it up there and slid everything into place and turned it on did they discover it had warpage, and it was screwing everything up. And they're like, oh my God, we spent more money than we've ever spent before on a space telescope, and we got the lens wrong, or the mirrors wrong. I think it was mirrors. And, you know, eventually they had to do a mission to go back up there and pull out the old mirrors and put in new ones, or maybe they slid in a correction. I don't know which one they did, but they had to actually physically change the thing.
Corrector.
The corrector. They slid a corrector in. And of course, if you've seen the before and afters, which they did at the time, the corrector is just brilliant, right? I mean, it's just the images are so much better now with that warpage corrected. But in between, they did a very interesting thing. And the thing that they did was they figured out how to apply algorithms based on a detailed understanding of the specific warpage that this had, so that they could unwarp the image, knowing how it was warped. And this is a metaphor for what Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Arendt and Kafka and Smith all want us to do. They want us to stop buying the modernist orthodoxy that the human mind is a perfect organ of truth, and that what it gives us is the way things actually are. And they want us to understand that the human mind evolved into place for reasons, and it has a structure for reasons, and its faculties are related to each other and to the behavior that it generates in us for reasons. And that if we want to do any better than we come out of the box, we have to wield philosophy through praxis, not just through understanding, but wield the full philosophy to try to introduce the unwarping, that the equivalent to what we did to Hubble, so that we can know where our distortions are and roll some of them back. And Hegel talks about this specifically. He talks about the intellect like someone trying to attract birds with a lime stick, to draw them so that you can net the bird without changing it and see the bird as it actually is, instead of shot or damaged or altered. And he says the problem is, if you go through this process and you learn how to unwarp your mind to try to undo some of the damage that's done through the process of conceiving and thinking, what you end up with still isn't the truth, because the truth doesn't involve all this warping and unwarping. None of that is the truth. That's just extra work we're having to do in order to get closer to the truth than we would be by default. So Hegel's with you, Stephen, and with Nietzsche, not surprisingly, since Nietzsche studied Hegel, as a critique of this assumption that we see things the way they actually are. He says it's a dangerous assumption. It feeds the ego. It feeds people into having way too much certainty for their ideas and theories, so that they then begin to treat the world and themselves and one another not as they actually are, but as they have conceived them in their understanding, which of course is not the way that they are. And this is, the model, a non-emotive, a non-emotional, non-irrational, it's a purely rational model for how bigotry works. That I treat you not as you actually are naturally, but that I treat you as I conceive of you instead. And that in order to hurry up the process of getting to know people, to conceive of them, I decide to conceive of them en masse, as an abstraction, alienated from all the richness that makes them who they actually are. Phil, and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I understand. I kind of understand Peter's frustration, but I see it slightly differently. That is, it to me is it's a paradox, because when you criticize something, you are within that system in which you're criticizing. I mean by that specifically the words. And even when you're criticizing, then you use the same words that you're criticizing, and that in itself reinforces the thing you're criticizing at the same time you're criticizing it.
That's right.
So, but the alternative is just equally is difficult, equally as difficult, maybe as equally impossible, is to invent new languages, or at least plug in different words. And when you do that, what happens is that you can only do so much before somebody says, this is incomprehensible. I mean, what the hell does it mean? Because we're used to how these words mean this way, and this is like learning a whole nother language. And so therefore, in a sense, it's almost like you're damned if you do, if you damned if you don't.
Yes.
I kind of find that in the same way as Dada, which I love Dada, but it was sort of criticizing artiness by putting a urinal in front of it as an art or not art. And it's like, okay, yeah, but you're still within the system, and then suddenly that becomes incorporated into the system that you're criticizing. So, I mean, it almost seems an impossible paradox to solve. I mean, if you solve that in a way that you could transcribe it in such a way, or invent a language in such a way in which it flows so easily into this new understanding, that would be the way to go. But on the other hand, you really can't do that, because we're all stuck with the words we already got. We could invent some new words, but not too many, because like, particularly when it's frozen in the dictionary. So all you could do is go around in circles. And so that, I mean, that is embedded within the structure. So not only the whole structure, but particularly the words. And I'm using those words right now to
Right.
talk about these things. So it's like, how the hell do you get out of this? And to a certain degree, maybe that's why, that's why my dean says, well, hell, like, you don't have to take a language. I'll excuse you from that, but for heaven's sakes, language is one of the few instruments that academia has to make sure people don't remain parochial. Because you have another language, at least you're shifting a little bit into another perspective.
Yes.
And that is the reason. It's not to force you into another language, another estrangement, but in order to allow you to say, oh, there's a whole nother way of looking at things. So
Right.
I by that argument, even though he says you could be excused from this, I personally don't care, because he saw that I was very diverse in my thinking. But I accepted his argument. And I obeyed the structure that he saw, even though it was a burden to me. But nonetheless, it was important within that particular structure to have that diversity. So
Yeah. Yeah. This is one of the core Kenneth Smith problems that he talks about. The things that are the most important for us to become clear about, to be able to get any leverage against our own minds, to be able to dilate ourselves out of the really suffocating finitude of the way the culture coils us up. All those words are murky and confusing. And even when we're precise about them, we're usually precise in an idiosyncratic way that other people don't share our definition. And so we can't communicate effectively with each other to try to say what we're trying to say. And however bad those words might be, those words all have flavor to us because they're the words we grew up with. They're the words that we wrote our first essays in, that we talked to our parents in when we were dependent on them. They're the words that we dream in, and that where all of the juice of life has been attached to. And so when someone says, your words are very murky and are not illuminating the thing you're trying to talk about, well, you need new words. Those new words, they're going to have no juice. And remember when we talked about the model of the mind, where what each of the lobes of the mind is trying to do is say, well, what can I produce that has the greatest juice that can become what I think about next? There is this unfair competition when you're trying to introduce new terminology, but your brain has applied all the juice to the old terminology that doesn't make any sense. And it's like, well, why would I want to say gnosis or Verstand when I can say imagine, right? Because imagine carries all this richness from our whole life behind it. Whereas gnosis, unless we've been doing Greek or philosophy, gnosis is like, well, this word, what? It carries nothing. It hasn't. Yes, 'twas brillig in the slithy toes. It's like maybe we can be playful about it, but it doesn't really feel anything for us. And so part of the problem is that the problem of breaking free from a single worldview is a lot harder than the problem of breaking out of a labyrinth. The thing about a labyrinth is you can look at it and see walls, but the labyrinth of the mind has no walls. You think you're not in a labyrinth. You think you are freely choosing to turn right and failing to recognize that you always turn right at this point in the steps, because that's the way the labyrinth goes. And thinking that you're freely choosing it is part of the process. And thinking that you're not trapped and that there's no walls is part of the process of being trapped. And so what it means is we're trying to introduce all this new language to bring into focus something that's invisible to us, and that we not only disbelieve in, but we disbelieve in the possibility of it. We think it's not a thing you have to disbelieve in. We think it's a non-thing. We think it's nonsense that somebody is imposing all these claims about our mind and our life that we know are false. We know we're free. We know that we are not constrained by anything. And so the last thing in the world we're going to accept is the idea that we have to pick up a whole armload of new vocabulary and new concepts just to bring into focus something that we don't think is real anyway. Now, that's the challenge of getting one new perspective. The idea that what you should have is dozens of new perspectives, and that for each one, it shouldn't just be some warped version that's comfortable for my current worldview, but that I actually have to make myself uncomfortable again and again and again with each one to put together a new perspective that's alien to mine and doesn't feel good, and that there's a payoff at the end of this. but we have to keep adding all this meta language, alternative definitions, and keep talking about invisible things that we don't believe in. This is just beyond most people's minds. They just won't do it. It's so impractical, so meta, so what if, that it just feels like gibberish or nonsense. And so that's how they stay trapped, that they're unwilling to, they can't, to use Kenneth's metaphor, they can't dislocate the joint of their mind to turn it back upon itself because it's too uncomfortable and it doesn't seem to serve any purpose. Seems like a waste of time. Why wouldn't they rather eat a yummy meal or watch or listen to their favorite music or you know, make love to their lover? Why would they want to spend one more moment learning long polysyllabic words and being told that the definitions are all wrong and they have to think about it anyway? They just don't want to. Why would you? Donald, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is probably going to be pretty incoherent.
Yay.
More incoherent than normal. But I don't think that these writings by Kenneth, he's not offering interpretations of Hegel or Heraclitus or Aristotle or Nietzsche or anything. He's not here as a academic philosopher trying to explain
right.
previous philosophers to us. I go back to this sentence that I found where he was talking about Freud, where Freud remarks on this oceanic feeling de facto, but little reflects on what is presupposed subjectively for us to be capable of experiencing it.
Yes.
We have said many times that Kenneth is an existential philosopher, but for the reader, whose existence is it? It's the reader's existence. It's not Kenneth's existence.
Right.
You know, I mean, and so he points us to things. He uses words. They are difficult, and we've discussed why. But, you know, as one guy once told me, I've had 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek, and 2 years of calculus, and I haven't got a clue what you're saying. But anyway, he's using these things to point to things. And I think it's like, here is something that you, in your own life, as you live it, experience. Now, what must be true for you to be capable of having that experience?
Yes.
And by the way, here's some other people that had similar experiences, perhaps, and wrote them in books and got a little bit about what these prior powers of mind or spirit or soul or whatever you want to call it. I don't think Kenneth, he's kind of hung up on vocabulary, but not for its sake, just to point at things.
Right.
And so what he's pointing at, and I think the real statement in this thing, it's on the same page with the thing from Freud, is he's pointing you to ice axes. So
yes.
You might grab an ice axe by the handle and break yourself, you know, awaken from your dogmatic slumbers. But I think that was Kant reading Hume, and I think that was, we would have preferred that he remained in his slumber, but I could be wrong. But it's this, and so to go through Kenneth saying, well, you know, I think he missed it on Nietzsche here. Nietzsche really was saying this, or Kierkegaard he's not too good. He's off on the aesthetic personality and Kierkegaard or something. Just, I think Kenneth would say, okay, fine.
Right.
But did you pick up the ice axe?
Right.
Did it break up your thinking? Have you moved on? And I sort of come to that because if there was a man or is a man today, probably that doesn't reflect, sometimes says very negative things about his predecessor, who is a torpedo fish, like Socrates was, that
Right.
if you make some comment, half thought out, off the cuff, whatever, you don't get a that's wrong because.
Right.
You get something that says, oh, I didn't think about that. That's a perspective I haven't thought of. And so one goes back, not to Kenneth, one goes back to oneself
Mm-hmm.
to explore, to become more aware of your own thinking,
Yeah.
how you get into these things. And I just, there are other ways. I know there's got to be other ways to read Kenneth. And I've never even discussed with Kenneth how I read him. I mean, according to him, it would probably be, well, you never have read me because you haven't understood a word I've said. But I have.
I wouldn't say that.
I have myself tried to put together something that has, from reading him, I have been hit with that ice axe, or
Yes.
have self-inflicted it on myself many times, and have come to find out that I don't believe what initially I thought I believed, or I don't think. I've changed my thinking.
Yeah.
I've whatever,
Hmm.
That's and there's one, this is totally apart from that. There's a recent article in the Atlantic Monthly on the authoritarian personality. Goes
Mm.
back to Adorno,
Adorno, yes.
and it said that psychology up until recently considered, following Adorno, that the authoritarian personality was a right-wing phenomena only, that it applied only to one side. And when you talk, we're saying about nobody reads Arendt or pays attention or whatever, how one would believe that authoritarian personality was confined to some narrow part, having read The Origins of Totalitarianism,
Right.
which shows that from dog catchers on up, almost every political system is rife with people. If only we could make them behave the way we want them to behave, we could solve all the problems. That is, authoritarian personality
Yeah.
might be the dominant personality type that goes with modernity, because
Yes.
everybody knows better. Well, enough. Too incoherent, but
It's called the anal stage in psychology.
Control.
are you talking about me?
No,
I'm
I'm talking about the authoritarian personality relates to the anal stage in psychology.
In Freud.
Oh, I'm at the demented stage in life.
You possibly never got that far. Yeah, I think most philosophers never got out of the pram. They never got out of the boat. Never get out of the boat unless you're prepared to go all the way.
Well, on that note, let's call on Sharon. Go ahead, Sharon. Oh, you're on mute.
I almost forgot what I was going to say. Well, I want to support Donald. I didn't think he was being incoherent, because I'm reading Kenneth Smith with a very meager philosophical background, and my after listening to Peter, one of the things, what's been happening to me is I've been getting a perspective as I read this. And so I found this paragraph, I read this paragraph in the middle of it, which I think culminates all that he's saying. He says, expecting moderns to be radically self-creative when their culture systematically strips them of all the concrete cultural content that might act as soulish or spiritual alphabets is expecting fleas to jump when their legs have been cut off.
Yes.
Ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing, nothing is going to get produced. Humans require raw materials. They require means and tools and techniques and instructions, as well as a repertory of ends, principles, values, teleological orientations, hierarchies of perspective, etc. If anyone wants to know where such an unholy and vast mass of aborted personalities came from in the modern society, the modern many, one virtually has to look no farther than the vacuous or abstractivist code that deprives all of them of cultural traction and grit and encourages their dualistic lethargy and their banausic materialism. Now, I think that kind of, and you can correct me on this, Rick, that kind of summarizes it. And when he's doing the analysis of spirit and soul as male and female and comparing it to yin and yang, he's doing it inside the mythos and logos culture in which we live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's, you're right. This is where he's going with this. He's basically arguing that the tragic irony of logos culture is that its claim to fame is that it's better at understanding than any other form of culture. But the tragedy is that the way that it organizes itself encourages an extrinsicalist focused on pragmatism and use value that causes us to turn what's inside of us into a blind spot. And that blind spot is precisely where all the tools are that we need in order to understand what it means for us to be a part of this culture, what it means to our minds and our decision-making practices, what it means about our place in history. And so we sort of have this, instead of having a distinctively excellent objectivity, we have a distinctive benightedness.
Yes.
Because no culture in the history of the world has ever so industrialized and scientized the process of mass producing people who don't know who they are or what they're doing. No one ever had this level of control before. That's what we've developed. And the result of the control is that, you know, that whole idea about power corrupting, power making stupid, that the problem with that is that the more power you have, the bigger your mistakes are and the bigger your blind spots are. You know, and so the result is when you systematize a civilization so that it's able to do things on a scale nobody's ever been able to do before, that means the same is true of its blunders. They're the biggest blunders ever made before in history because nobody had that much control over themselves or the world as we do now. And so this blind spot towards what are the cultural resources you need in order to be able to unfold beyond Begriff and beyond Verstand into Vernunft. What do you need inside of yourself? What do you need to have learned and experienced in life to be capable of doing that is a question we can't even ask because we don't even have a clear structure of our own minds, let alone of any kind of obligation or duty to mature. We think you're an adult when you hit 18 and that's the definition. I lived this long and now I'm an adult. And, you know, it's like, it is the most vacuous concept of an adult in the history of cultures. It's like there's no expectations other than follow the machine and do what it says and be this old. The idea that, well, you might actually need resources of culture and personality in order to overcome your own biases, in order to overcome your addiction to your own ideas and your craving for ideologies and totalitarian organization. These ideas are missing in us. We've just they've never been cultivated in us. We're you know, he tries to find ways to say this in different ways in different essays, but he does come back to this theme over and over. The Hyle, Hyle, the Hyle, the matter from which we generate form. Every creator except for the medieval Christian creator had to make things from something. We can't create things ex nihilo. We need resources to build on. And all that has to be done to prevent us from making a better world is to deny us those internal resources so that we can't lift ourselves up to the perspective, the Archimedean standpoint that's required to look around and go, whoa, is this it? I could do better than this. I should do better than this. As long as we can't lift ourselves to that point, we will comply with whatever weird mechanistic schema our culture ends up imposing upon us, because we don't know there's alternatives, and we don't know that we have a responsibility to do something about those alternatives. So I'm glad you cited this bit. A lot of people, their initial reaction to Kenneth Smith's philosophy is they think that he is a misanthrope because he criticizes us. And what we don't understand is that moderns are more self-flattering than any people in the history of the world, because we're systematically self-flattering. We flatter ourselves, we flatter our system, we flatter our culture, we flatter our science, we flatter our politics. There's like, it's all the best that's ever been, right? Unless we're in a cranky mood. The rest of the time, we all know that you're supposed to say, it's a great march of progress that leads to us. And, you know, God bless us for how wonderful we are. And what we can't see is that that level of self-flattery makes it so that we resist critiquing ourselves. Because instead of seeing a self-critique as information, we interpret it as an attack, because it's so alien to our experience of how we relate to ourselves. And that creates the perfect medium for incubating a deeply anti-philosophical, anti-introspective, anti-historical culture. Because they don't want to be uncomfortable ever.
So the learning tool here is raising of consciousness, as we talked about.
Yes.
And give in a perspective which at times he is historical.
Yes. Yes. I think we talked about that last week, that idea that, I think Donald brought that up, that one of the distinctive qualities of Kenneth Smith's philosophy is that everything he says is said from a historical perspective. Even the individual, it's always described as they actually naturally are. And what they naturally are is someone who has unfolded from an earlier self and who is still unfolding and going to unfold into something else. This notion that things can't be understood out of context, they have to be understood in their specific individual history, is kind of at the core of this existentialist tradition. And again, because history is not in fact a great march of progress and triumphs that lead to our glorious selves, because it involves blunders and crimes and things we need to be ashamed of and learn from, that all makes us uncomfortable. As you know, as a quintessential modern, we only want to consume history in ways that please us, like trivia, or I have a favorite subject or period and that's what I know things about, or history bores me, but I like this historical fiction, so I'm going to read historical fiction or watch historical fiction movies and then live my life as though that's what actually happened because it pleased me to consume history that way. There's like so many ways to go wrong and not understand our own context for how we got here. And in modernism, we do all of them. They're all available to us as options. And the one that is the hardest to get a hold of is a clear, direct, honest assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of our history and the trap that we're in. I think it was a couple of months ago we talked about the fact that one of the things that can be daunting about Kenneth Smith's thing is that most people want to skip past this part. It's like, well, what's the answer? How do we get to utopia? Can we stop talking about uncomfortable things and just go to the recipe for a good life? And Kenneth denies us that. He's like, I'm no guru. I don't know what the good life looks like. I'm a modern, just like you are. And that means I was raised in this mess and I have the blinkers and blinders that you have. What I'm going to do is diagnose in great detail specifically why you're stuck and all the different ways you're stuck that you don't think you're stuck, but you are stuck. And he's going to do that not on the basis necessarily of, trying to attack or criticize, but by saying all of us as moderns have these same problems that prevent us from fully taking in the scope of the problem we're trying to overcome. And until we can see the problem as it actually is, we're never going to get out of it. So
one more thing.
Yeah.
I was surprised, I guess, at Kenneth's criticism when he was talking about love. And he tied Nietzsche into it. He says one of the most common typical crises arising out of these self-relations and disrelations is the viability or instability of love. And he goes on to compare human beings to animals. And that was Nietzsche's philosophy. He says, in most cases, as Nietzsche observed, all that happens between humans is that two animals find one another, and there can never be any stabilizable relation because feelings and desires and appetites are all of experiences, the most mercurial and fluctuating. Now, I kind of found that disturbing.
It's where you've probably heard the critique that says that love isn't a feeling, it's an action or a decision.
Yes.
This is what he's alluding to, that as consumers and members of a consumer culture, we want love to please us in the same way that we want everything to please us. We think you just go get the thing that makes you happy and then you're done. And it makes us incompetent at love because we try to reduce love to being not to say that love doesn't include profound feelings, but we try to reduce it to being only the feelings. And what that leaves us vulnerable to as the Achilles heel of modern love is the very first time our feelings change, we go, oh, I guess I must not be in love anymore. And then we break up. And you see this all the time. You see it in Hollywood marriages. You see it all over the culture. We have this empty, vacuous notion of love that makes it impossible to create an enduring foundation in the way that people could do when they knew that love was more than that it was more profound and more complete. So he's not trying to dismiss love. He's trying to say love is a lot more than what we are led to understand, and by trying to minimize it the way we do, we destroy the foundations of enduring relationships. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, I understood it in the sense you described, but I just thought his description was a little acerbic.
Well, yeah, this is he likes to slap modernism around, right? And
Yeah.
so, there's things that we take for granted as natural that should shame us and lead us to want to be better than that. But because it's so common, we let ourselves decide that it's normal. One of his critiques of modernism is that, if you trace back the word norm and normal, they didn't describe the average. They described the norms we were supposed to raise ourselves up to. We were supposed to exert ourselves to meet norms of good behavior. But we have redefined normal to mean the average. And so now, instead of normal being something you strive, that makes you strive to lift yourself up, it becomes something you just accept because, yeah, sure, I cheated on my taxes and I sped through the light and, I ripped off my neighbor, but it's normal. That's what we're all doing. So therefore it's fine, because it's retained the notion that it's okay, but it's lost the notion that it's something you have to strive to lift yourself up to. Mm-hmm. So there's this way in which he likes to slap around moderns for the humiliating ways in which we have slumped below a mature experience of adulthood into a kind of infantilized consumer culture of passive dependence. And so what he's doing here, which is really uncomfortable because it's really out of fashion, is he's slapping around modern versions of love and saying, if you aren't going to bring any values or principles to love, if you're not going to bring any commitment to love, if you're not there to build anything enduring at all, if all you're doing is talking about the puppy love, the temporary puppy love that you feel while someone is pleasing you before they expose themselves to you as a fully actualized human being who has things that might make us uncomfortable that we have to learn how to deal with. it shouldn't even be called love. It's such a juvenile version of love that it's almost animalistic in its reduction.
That's culturing something.
Yes.
The word's culture.
Culturing is, yeah, just right on the money here. Exactly.
Yes.
Stephen. He's saying there is a culturelessness to modernism, in which instead of culturing ourselves to lift ourselves up, we let ourselves slump down into these bad forms of existence.
We have been living in a culture of convenience that
Yes.
views everything as a packet of candy. You get the packet, open it up, get out the lolly, put it in your mouth, and you should have instant satisfaction.
Yes, yes, exactly. So, as he says, the weakness, and this comes out of Hegel, by the way, too. Gnosis in its naive form has the great strength that it plugs you into the juices of life, your dreams, your hopes, your feelings, your experiences. And by being plugged in, it gives nature a chance to teach you. Because unlike most of our systems and ideas, nature's coherent. Nature has what the Greeks thought was a divine quality that human beings lack, which is that nature makes complex systems that actually work. And it's not that everything that happens in nature is good, but that when something bad happens in nature, it doesn't all fall apart, it keeps going. The system is self-healing, self-reinforcing, and it's able to handle things at a scale that is really inconceivable to human beings. And so one of the good things about Gnosis, even in its naive form, even the way an infant experiences it, is that it plugs us into that order that makes sense. So when we align ourselves with it, maybe some things don't come out well, maybe some things do, but at least it's coherent at a deep fundamental level. As we try to emerge from that in order to create a more predictable world, in order to have more control over the world, to make it so that the bad things happen less often and the good things happen more often, we generate a new kind of system, the noetic system, the noetic experience of life, in which we try to systematize things to make them predictable. But in the course of doing that, even though we open up the scale of imagination for ourselves of how the world could be and how we could make it be, we are unplugging ourselves from that direct connection with reality. And so we increasingly get this ability to imagine completely implausible things, but that make sense to us. And modernism as a logos culture turns that up to 11 and argues that the very making sense itself is the proof of its objectivity. Because it makes sense to us, we believe it's true. You'll see this in philosophy classes, by the way, and also philosophy clubs. People will listen to an argument and then say, well, I see what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense to me, and therefore I'm not convinced. As though our personal feelings of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, our sense of the coherence and how it matches our existing worldview, as though that were authoritative in the world, as though the world were bound to make sense to us, which it isn't, of course, at all. That way in which
we're getting back to Nietzsche and God is dead.
Right, we're getting back to Nietzsche and God is dead. The abstract God of noesis isn't a real God.
Well, so the tragedy is that the rationalists, they killed God.
Yes.
And they've continued along with all the precepts of Christianity.
Yes.
This is what Nietzsche was saying. But they don't realise they've undermined
the very
everything
thing they
that
thought
they're
they were
believing in.
That's right. That's right. It says there's a core argument here that without gnosis, without that immersion in the profound infinities full of rich juices of the natural order, we can't actually experience the sacred. That oceanic feeling that we've alluded to is part of gnosis, and it's not any part of noesis. And when you suck all the juice out of it to make something organized and systematic, like converting Jesus from a person with a personality and a life who did all kinds of things, some of which we understand and some of which we don't. When you evacuate Jesus of all of those qualities and all you're left with is a get out of hell free recipe, you've sucked the gnosis out of him, turned him into noesis, and now he's dead because noesis is inherently dead. It's mechanistic. It's empty. It has no meaning or profundity to it. Anyway, he's arguing in a sense that about love, he's saying, the same thing is true when we try to reduce love to a simple consumer culture exchange value thing. It must please me or else it's not worth the price that I pay for it. It isn't love anymore. It's lost all the gnosis. It's lost all the juice. It's become this transaction. And our problem is that as part of perfecting the systematization of the modern epoch, we're trying to redefine everything that way.
Well, then, and Rick, then what is love in your opinion? So what is the more perfect form of love then?
Well, this is the difference between an existentialist answer and an escapist answer. If I were an escapist, I'd tell you, here's what love is, but I'm not. I'm an existentialist. And so my response is, we know love is a thing in the world, that it's a real thing. We can experience it. We can observe it. We can see that it's there. We can see how it moves people. But like all real things, it's infinite and it goes beyond any definition that I could apply to it. I can try to describe it, but only as long as in the course of my description, I never prioritize my description over the reality. The reality is more important and more profound than anything that I could have to say about it. Our mammalian drive to bond with each other and take care of each other, to be more than a bunch of atomized individuals, is critical to our survival as a species, as a genus, as a family, the whole class Mammalia. And we're not the only ones that do it. There are plenty of other animals that do. Love goes very deep into the foundations of why we can exist at all, why there still are people, why they evolved in the first place.
But the consumer culture of love that it seems to fit with what you were saying, but our love for our children, for example, or a child, I think that's quite different. That is that does feel infinite and maybe pure, if you want to use the word pure.
Yeah.
Because I think kind of love that consumer culture kind of love that you're referring to is more about romantic love, perhaps, love between.
Well, it applies to both. You see plenty of modern parents who are like, well, if this kid isn't going to be, convenient for me and please me all the time, then I don't like them anymore. So how many people are in love with a fetus but hate their teenage kid because the teenage kid says no? Right? I don't want you to say no. I don't want you to disagree with me. You have to be a Xerox of all my values. And if you're an actual person and you start pushing back against me, then you don't please me anymore. And now the transaction isn't worthwhile. It's just,
yeah, you do have a point there. Yeah.
Modernism teaches us to be incompetent parents because we expect even parenthood to be a consumer transaction, which is astonishing. But, if earlier in this essay, the part where he talks about the soul and the body and the Buddhist line that they're not one and not two, where he's breaking down the dualism between the soul and the body, he's talking about something that applies to love as well. And he said this in other places. One of the fundamental flaws of modernism is the way that it aborts the higher infinitizing possibilities of gnosis and turns it into a self-coiled finitized form, begriff, in which it becomes a juvenile thing, an infantile thing. And that modernism does the same thing to noesis, where noesis and ideas could lead us out into the larger infinite universe of possibilities. We abort the higher potential of noesis. We clip it and turn it back around on itself, coil it on itself so that it finitizes us. The goal of noesis in the modern era is not to think about alternative possibilities because that would rock the boat. We're supposed to learn the law, learn the market, learn what we're supposed to do, and be perfect cogs in the machine and fit in. And if there are bugs here and there, then we can innovate, but only to the extent that we add the missing gear or solder the broken wire of the machine. We're not supposed to fundamentally change anything. And it puts us into a position where this kind of consumer culture approach to all the things that matter in life comes naturally to us. We're constantly trying to finitize things and turn them into objects of exchange. We want love to be an object of exchange. We want parenthood to be an object of exchange. Voting, right, has been turned into a transaction. You go to the booth, you pull the lever, and you get the politics you want. There is this simple sense of, I exchange this for that. And the problem is, as long as we stay stuck inside these finitized modes of thought of the Banausoi and the Douloi, it all makes sense to us. He says part of what's so important about love is that it does this Buddhist thing, the compassion of breaking down the boundaries, that the law of the excluded middle that teaches us to see things as separable objects, alienated from each other, that are just exchanged for one another. Love creates a merging in which we begin to identify with our object of love. And if it's mutual, they begin to identify with us. And that forces us out of the little envelope that modernism has entrained us to think of ourselves as. We start to have this amazing experience in which our sense of our identity goes beyond ourselves. And we start to think that, there's more to me than what I've been told in school and told by the market. It goes beyond a simple identity. And that rupture in the bubble is the rupture in the finitude of Begriff or Verstand, that just for a moment makes them be able to sniff the larger possibilities of what gnosis could and should develop into, and what noesis could and should develop into. And we can begin to see that maybe there's more to being human than the recipe that we've been given, that's been indoctrinated into us. Maybe
the medieval church was smart. They outlawed marriage for their priests.
Right? They're trying to stop that.
There's only one loyalty, that's to Mother Church. Overrides all other loves.
Right.
Only one love, Mother Church.
Right. Because if you start falling in love with things of this world, then you might start to disbelieve the dogma that all value and all meaning comes from only one source, and that's outside the world and imposed upon it. You might start to love your child. You might start to love, your spouse. You might love a tree. And these are all heresies in the original medieval version of Christianity, in which this is all worthless dreck. The only thing that matters is the one source of meaning, and you have to, relentlessly focus on that. You're right. Marriage gets in the way of that. Marriage ruptures that envelope and starts to infinitize us. And infinitized people are dangerous people. They're creative, they're imaginative, they start thinking about how to make a better world and how to take care of each other in new ways. Phil, go ahead. You've had your hand up such a long time.
Yeah. Now in this discussion, I want to talk about 2 points, and they're quite different. One is, later on today, I'm going to go to a meetup of Daniel Dannett. I listened to a lot of his videos.
Yeah.
And I have a kind of a push-pull. So I want to see what the meeting's like. Because on the one hand, he seemed to be very smart and say a lot of wise things. But there was one thing that sort of struck me as interesting. It was really about the relationship between men and technology. He seemed to be a technologist as well as a thinker, and And so he said that, he once wanted, with a small group of people, wanted to invent something that was very, very difficult that might make the teaching of music and harmony easier. So they try, and they discussed it, with some musicians and with some thinkers and so forth. And they finally decided they didn't have to do anything, because the perfect manifestation of it in terms of instrument was the piano.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, oh yeah, that's very clever, because I love, music, and I love particularly classical music and the harmony it produces and all that. How wonderful. But then I thought, well, that's kind of interesting because that excluded other things, other
Yes.
instruments, such as the sitar or the gamelan and all that, as if they were not, they were imperfect or less perfect at least.
Right.
And so I thought, well, that's a very interesting trap in itself, despite the fact that I love the music it produces, because it's already channeling something into a structure. We
Yes.
have the perfect. And so I thought that was a very keen relationship between men and instrumentality that we've
Yes.
been trapped into it so deeply. So it's not just the words, I guess the words are the technology of the mind, but the technology of instrumentation has also put us in this role. So we're trapped at many levels. So I'm gonna go to that meeting and see how that's resolved. Because on the one hand, he does say some very wise things.
Right.
For instance, he said, be careful of this argument, like who's to say what is right and wrong?
Uh-huh.
And that's Charlie Brown, right? And then Lucy says, I will. Which completely throw the whole thing argument off, right? And so it seems a very, very interesting thing. The other thing I was going to say is go back to this thing about the spirit and the soul.
Yeah.
The fact that the living instruments of the inner self. And I think, and that goes back to Hegel, so that dialectic in a sense is oppositional, but of course he wrote it into time, and time changes the dynamic a lot. So when you talk about Hegel and when you talk, re-Hegel as well as I could, it's like there seemed to be a kind of arrogance in his tone. But on the other hand, there's also a kind of real humility, like we are evolving, we're not incomplete,
Right.
And this, once you roll this sort of this opposition, into a dynamic, it changes it because, in a sense, that creative tension, I think of it as like a dynamic tension that exists between love and hate, or thesis and antithesis. It allows it to then create the synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of, once again, I'll go back to art. In terms of art, somebody has deeply inspired me. Was a guy named Hans Hofmann, who had his principle of push-pull, was essentially the same thing. That art should have this relationship of this tension, not the tension that remains whatever, but a tension that creates the energy in between that allows a still thing like art to embed the sense of energy that it produces in the thing, rather than just a mere representation of the thing. So
Right.
And so that was interesting, that when you roll it into time and movement, it changes it, because and then you have to also accept that you are in the process, and the process therefore is incomplete. And so therefore you are expanding. And I think without that opposition, then you're, I guess, you stay the same, spirit talks to itself, soul talks to itself or remains silent in itself. And you don't have that interaction that produces culture. And I kind of think, despite of, what arrogance you might think Hegel has, that one fact that he understood, that he is incomplete and culture itself is incomplete, completely changes it to a kind of much more humble and pious attitude as well, as this sort of projection of itself into the world. So I just want to add that as the second thing. So the relationship of this tensional relationship And of course, once again, going back to Artemis and Eris, you got to be very careful with culture because it could it could evolve without that dynamism that creates a unity out of the a synthesis out of that opposition. You are going to leave into warring states, which is exactly where we're at, and which is exactly what China was at back in 500 AD, right? The period of warring states in which everybody is at each other's throat. And that's why.
It's what we're meant to be.
No, I don't think so. I think you're trying to find some dynamism that'll roll you out of it. And China is still in that stage where they want to freeze the structure itself. So, okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to call on Stephen in just a second, but I do want to underscore the thing about the humility. It's easy because Hegel wants to be taken seriously, because he's writing in the style of Kant, and because the style of Kant is so daunting. It's easy to take him as arrogant. And as a European from a certain era, he has a certain irreducible arrogance that we all have, because as a colonizer culture, we don't question our right to take the world's resources and dispose of them as we see fit. So there is some there. But the humility is important to underscore because, when he talks about finitizing and infinitizing, I think people just sort of tune out and assume that's gibberish. They don't get really what he means. And it's the problem of trying in your own mind as a finite person who has a date of birth and a date of death after which your ideas aren't going to get any better. This is all the time you get to try to figure out the world. But the world is not only infinite in a simple way, like counting numbers. The world is infinite in almost inconceivable ways. I talked a few months ago about the idea of life as a kind of principle, that all true principles are infinite in the kind of way that life is, where every living cell is alive, one infinity. But on top of that infinity, every living cell is different from every other living cell, which is another infinity, right? It's like infinity, and I'm just going to use metaphors here. It's like infinity squared. It's like infinity times infinity. But as if that weren't enough, every living cell is also transforming itself to adapt to its environment to become something new. They're not holding still, they're changing over time, which is a third dimension of infinity. And all I've done here is sketch in the barest notes of how life works in the world. Infinities upon infinities upon infinities. And somehow we're supposed to model that with 60 to 100 years of experience, much of which we spend asleep or sleepwalking through our life, right? So part of what Hegel is trying to say is the thing that's important to understand about the structure of soul and ego and spirit, the metabolism of the mind and how it represents the world, is how wildly inadequate any mortal mind could possibly be to the task of trying to represent infinities upon infinities upon infinities. All our perspectives are necessarily deeply warped. And that includes himself. He too is a mortal who's finite, and no matter how hard he tries to be clear and crisp, and he tries as hard as he can, right? He's using Kant as his model. He's trying to be absolutely crisp. He knows everything that he's writing is a horrific distortion of the truth because he's a mortal being, and he's only got the time that he's got to do it. And it's easy when you're reading Kenneth Smith or Hegel or Nietzsche or any of these guys to come away with the idea that they thought a great deal of themselves, right? But the thing that unites these existentialists, aside from whatever irreducible ego they might have, is that because they're existentialists, they look in a way that most philosophers don't want to look. They look directly at the irreconcilable difference between the infinite cosmos and the finite mind we're attempting to use to represent it. And they recognize and say right up front, these tools are wholly inadequate to the job. We're going to try to help you use them as well as you can. We're going to try to learn from each other and do better. But no matter how good we get, we must start by embracing the fundamental sacred truth that we don't get to dictate terms to reality, and that our attempts to model it fall far, far short of the truth. So yeah, I agree with you about irreducible humility is sort of
Rick,
built in. Yeah, Ginny, go ahead.
so how can you talk about cell as being infinite and yet mortars are finite? I don't understand what you're saying.
So if you were to try to count the cells just in your own body, you'd die before you finished.
Cells in our body?
Cells, the number of cells
in our body is infinite?
It's at a scale of number that might as well be infinite because we can't even approach it. And it's not just you that's made of cells. Each of us is made of cells. All people are made of cells. All animals are made of cells, all fungi, all plants. The number of cells in the world and the diversity among them is incomprehensible to the human mind. It's basically infinite as far as we're concerned. And each one of those cells is busy all the time, always working and changing. They're not even objects. Each of them is a living system interacting with its environment, retooling itself, constantly changing. So this is what I mean when I say cells are, this life at this level is infinite because it's at scales we can't count, we can't enumerate, let alone categorize, catalog, and understand. It is beyond the capacity of Verstand. We couldn't even count the cells in one finger given an entire life. And that's not even describing them accurately, just trying to count them. There are so many cells in our bodies.
So is that what the existentialists mean about existence and that kind of leap into, the leap of faith is kind of a leap into existence itself? And
yeah, there's a leap of faith.
And that existence is infinite, right?
Yeah, that what it is we're trying to understand is at an entirely different scale of magnitude than we are. Mm-hmm. And even we ourselves are of a scale of magnitude that we can't understand. Even just one person or one brain is more than we can figure out in a lifetime. And that's why Heraclitus says you couldn't fathom the limits of the soul even if you spent your whole life trying. And Hegel's writing before the discovery of the cell, right? Or so early on that it hasn't been appreciated yet. So he's in talking about the infinities of the cosmos that we are inadequate to capture, he is predicting the later discovery that we're going to turn out to be made up of even bigger infinities he wasn't aware of, coiled up inside the things that we take for objects, our whole cosmoses of systems.
But isn't his idea of the absolute kind of a limitation on that kind of idea of infinitude?
No, he's trying to do the opposite. See, when we read Hegel, we're inclined to try to read the absolute as a thing, but he's attempting to break thingliness with the concept of the absolute, the idea of something that goes beyond things, that's at the scale of infinities. You always have to, whenever you're reading Hegel and he talks about the absolute, you have to read it with the infinite in mind. He's constantly setting up a dialectic between the finite and the infinite because that's the condition, that's the human condition, that our understanding and the duration of our life is finite, but the world that we're in is infinite, and even our own bodies and the consequences of the ideas that we think and the dreams we have and the feelings we have, those are all at the scales of infinities. This mismatch.
Even though we may feel that there are infinite number of cells and infinite, but at the same time, we know that there is a finite number of cells in our body or in an organism. I mean, because for me, the sense of infinite is just too mind-boggling. It kind of used to scare me to death because the concept of infinite is just, it just always bothered me. But you may be speaking figuratively that the amount of cells in our body is just so huge that it feels infinite, but then it is finite. It has to be finite, right? I mean, ultimately.
Well, there's a scale of numbers between the finite and infinite, which consists of finite numbers that are so big that for all practical purposes, they're infinite. Because we can't actually.
Well, the way when you use that word infinite that way, it feels more comfortable to me.
Yeah.
It's not as scary.
Yeah. Well, and And it's because we grew up in a culture that didn't prepare us for infinities. A mythos culture from the ground up prepares people for infinities. It's one of the fundamental differences between a mythos culture and a logos culture. A logos culture believes it can spell everything out. A mythos culture understands that's impossible, that there is more to the universe and more to ourselves than we will ever fathom. And that's part of the distinction he's trying to make in the book. So yeah.
But if everything is infinite, then the whole idea of the idea of finitude is not a fact. Then it's an illusion.
It's something we impose on the world through the way that we see things.
Right.
Yeah, and that's our problem. So, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah. It's just, that sort of gives me a point there. That was something in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. When you realise just how many people are on the Earth,
yes,
you wonder about your own significance in the scale of things. It provides for a really sort of nihilistic moment, doesn't it? You know, that it's like the number of sperms. You know, how many sperms are created in the order of existence, and it's only the rare one that has a happy occasion of meeting the egg. The rest,
right.
You're finished.
Right.
The question I was going to raise, I think Phil was bringing up, what is piety to the modern world? And this is something I'm striking again and again with the modern rationalists.
Yes.
Is they've gotten, this is like the revolution, this is like the Marxist revolution. We've overthrown the old God so we can become the new ones.
Yes.
And this is a tendency I see in people. There's in these older cultures, no matter how big you were, your reference was that there was something bigger than you. But in the modern world, they've gotten this crazy idea
Yes.
that there's nothing bigger than them.
Yes.
And they're making decisions on that basis, like exterminations.
Yes.
That we are it, we are the gods. So where's the piety in that? Who are they going to worship themselves?
Right.
But this is what I grab from the rationalists all the time.
Even
Yeah.
part of my presentation will address that.
Oh, good. Thanks, Peter.
They've gotten rid of God and they've decided we are the gods.
Yeah, this is Kenneth's line about the three epochs of European history, that in the modern epoch, the revolution against medievalism took the form of overthrowing God, but the medieval God had already had a revolution against the ancients of overthrowing nature. And so once you throw nature and God at the bottom, the only thing left at the top is us. And on the one hand, it might make us feel free in an abstract way to imagine that we'll just decide for ourselves what to do. In truth, what it does is it means we start creating cultures in which people are not from birth on expected to understand that they are finite creatures in an infinite cosmos. Instead, we center in the finite and say it's the most important thing. And it makes us incompetent at dealing with the many parts of life that are fundamentally about infinities, or that are about the mismatch between our own finitude and the infinite things that we have to be able to represent well, whether it's values, doing the right thing, whether it's understanding, complex relationships or what have you. All of these things require a familiarity with and a comfort with being a limited, fallible, finite thing within a universe in which infinite things are the frame of reference and meaning. Modernism, by doing what you described, Stephen, made itself incompetent to do the things that are most important for us to do. We're coming in towards, this is the critique anyway. We're coming up towards the part where we're going to start doing Peter's videos that sort of expand on where do we go from here and what are the other possibilities beyond what Kenneth has gotten into in this essay. But before we do, one thing I want to draw our attention to, if we're closing out the mythos and culture versus logos culture discussion that this book is about, the most important thing to take away is that in trying to anatomize the metabolism of the mind the way Hegel did, the metabolism of character that derives from that metabolism of mind, the metabolism of cultures that derive from those characters, in trying to draw through relationships between culture, character, and how we see the world, he and the other existentialists are creating or describing lawful, authoritative relationships between things that in the modern epoch we think of as completely separate. We think your personality is whatever it is, and that it has nothing to do with how you think. I mean, we can't imagine the act of thinking constraining the sort of person that you can become. We don't talk about each other that way. And we certainly don't talk about, like the United States as being constrained by the character types that it cultivates. These ideas are contra-modern because they're naturalistic. They're based on the idea that there are sinews and roots and dependencies and connections between things that in the modern epoch we've been taught are separated, alienated objects. In our quest to imagine ourselves as infinitely free, we've blinded ourselves to the relationships between things, the essential, life-giving relationships between things. The importance of the flow of the blood in our bodies. You try to understand how the cells in your feet stay alive, but you try never to speak of the circulatory system. The results are going to be incompetent. You can't explain how the nutrients get there. How does the oxygen get there? All the meaningful parts that make it possible for your toe to be alive have been eradicated from the understanding if you don't talk about that part, if you suppress it, if you're civilizationally need never to mention those connections, then you end up with blind spots so big they make you incompetent to be able to explain the basics. This is what Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Arendt and Hegel and Marx and Smith and others are saying about the way that we have dissected human thought from human character, from human culture, from the course of history, and tried to treat them as completely free and separable items. It's like looking at a dissected cat and thinking that the pieces on the board are the cat, and that this is all the life of a cat could ever be, is these objects lying here. This is how we treat ourselves and our culture. So in order to finish the loop for ourselves, why is he talking about these modes of thought and these character types in a book that is ostensibly about mythos and logos, cultures? What is the relationship fundamentally? And, the short answer is, well, he didn't write this book. David and I just put these essays together. And so, any mismatch between the title, ostensibly the subject and the contents, that's our fault for making a bad selection. But in fact, there is a relationship, and it's fundamental to this whole scheme. It's fundamental to Hegelianism and to the whole existentialist line. And it goes like this. These character types evolved in us for a reason. They're not accidents. We are not all delicate snowflakes who are all completely separate from each other, and we are not all the same kind of thing that is exactly identical. There is structure and metabolism to the way we think and to the way our characters and cultures develop. And that metabolism, just like the reason why our heart has 4 chambers, there is a reason why it is these 3 functions of the mind and the relationships they have to each other. There is a reason why an animal that evolved with a dearth of instincts, not none, but let's just say deeply evacuated compared to other animals, there's a reason why that animal needs the adult mature form to engage in Vernunft and become an heuristic personality. They have to. That is a survival trait of this species, just like the ability to run fast is for cheetahs. This is part of the core arete or excellence of Homo sapiens. And suppressing it, as modernism does, to try to reduce us back down to the 2 basal metabolic functions of the mind, endangers our survival capability at a fundamental existential evolutionary level. The very thing that is our gift is the thing that is being suppressed. So what is that thing? In the last minute or two, before we start into Peter's thing, what that thing is, the job of an Aristos, the reason why Vernunft exists, is to make it possible to grow beyond the finitized views of the world, to be able to imperfectly, uncomfortably, temporarily, from time to time, understand or envision or imagine the relationship between the finite and the infinite. Specifically so that you can take those insights and use them to restructure the culture so that the culture of human beings better aligns with the way that the world actually works. Now, this is not by prescription. This is not by utopia or totalitarianism. It has to be the opposite of that, because the way the world actually works is full of infinities. Any attempt to hem it in as a recipe and say this is what all people should think and this is what all people should do is by definition not an infinitizing culture. It's not capable of adapting us to an infinite life. The only thing that is a form of culture that cultivates within us an appreciation for the infinite and the ways that it intersects our lives and that we have to pay attention to it, as well as a toolkit of cultural practices that we can use to help us continue on the journey to discover the infinite and align ourselves with it. You know, it was Kafka who said, in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world. The cultures that survive in the long run, not in the petty time frame of modernism, but I mean in hundreds of thousands of years of time, are the ones that best equip the people that are part of that culture to be sensitive to and responsive to the vast ocean of things we don't understand, but that have authority over us in nature. To be curious and interested and engaged and always watching and always willing to go back and retune the rules of the society to change again as we learn new things. A growing, morphing culture that adapts. That's the only way we exist at all, is that for 200,000 to 300,000 years, our species has been full of mythos cultures that are constantly tuning in to what's wrong about the way we think about things and to what's different in the world around us and modifying the culture. That's what that adult form of thought and personality are for, is for that somebody needs to break out of the shell of the self-inclusive finitude of the basal metabolism of the mind and to look at the world closer to the way it really is, or at least listen to it closer to the way it is, you know, to be open to it the way that it is, so that it has opportunities to teach us those infinitudes so that we can bring them back to our people as a gift to the culture, and the culture can grow and change. And if nobody's doing that, then the culture devolves into a mechanism that's unable to respond to the infinities of nature and its changes. And then that civilization collapses. Modernism is a perfect storm, a perfect recipe for the collapse of itself, because it suppresses the Aristoi and the use of Vernunft. That is the core critique of this book. So we could pick this stuff up again in the future. We'll have a lot more discussions about this, but I want to give Peter time so that we can.
Can I just say one word before you say Peter?
Yeah.
Either the tragedy or the interesting fact is that that last sentence that you said, we are in that continuous process just now.
Yes.
Yes. And as different parameters, for example, technology, enter into our culture, I think the process gets accelerated. Thank you for 2 minutes, Peter.
Okay, Peter, how do we want to do this?
All right. I suppose as you get set for the video for screen sharing, I will try to do a bit of an introduction. So pretty much what I would like all of you to do, in whatever you imagine the mythos compared to the logos to be, I would like you to come at these ideas that are going to come at you as experiences. And I want you to feel them more than you think them. I want your imagination to play with them more than understand them. That is what I would like for you to do as I build these arguments in order to increase the chance of merit for particular experiences that I would like to direct. That is my asking for your attention.
You got it. All right, so you gave me a link for an initial video, so I should share my screen and play that video?
Yes, please.
Okay, we'll do share screen. And let me maximize this video so it fills up the space. All right. And presumably you'll pick up the audio. You'll have to let me know if you do or don't. So here we go. Ready?
brain is two brains, two hemispheres, each doing half the work of being you. Half your vision goes to each and half your movement directed by each. Right controls left and left controls right. Your two brains coordinate through a wire of nerves, but this wire can be cut and was, for a time, used as an epilepsy treatment. After the cut, people seemed the same, though their brain was split in twain. Except some post-split patients describe that while selecting their morning outfit with right hand, left might come along to disagree. Actually, left hand might quite often disagree, which these split brain patients found frustrating. What's happening? To investigate, remember, right brain sees and controls one half, while left brain controls and sees the other. But only left brain can speak, hello, because that's where the speech center is located. Right brain without this is mute. In normal brains, this doesn't matter because each half communicates across the wire with the other. But split brains can't, and thus you can show just the right brain a word, ask the person, what did you see, and you'll hear nothing. Because left speaking brain saw nothing. Meanwhile, right brain will use its hand to pick the object out of a pile hidden from left brain. This is deeply creepy. Ask why are you holding the object, and speaking left brain will make up a plausible sounding but totally wrong reason. I always wanted to learn how to solve one of these. Left brain isn't lying, it's just doing what brains do, creating a story that explains its past actions to its current self. A behavior which does rather cast doubt onto the notion of free will, but that's a story for another time. Creating reasons for why it does things is just something left brains do. It happens in normal, healthy humans all the time, and if you think about it closely, you know you've done this. Back to experiments. Give right brain an object, ask the person what's in your hand, and they won't be able to say, I'm not holding anything. And when asked to draw, a split brain can draw two separate objects simultaneously with each hand in a way unsplit brains find challenging. These experiments on split brain patients are deeply unsettling because they really point in the direction of a mute, separate intelligence, something living in the skull. You can even ask questions of a split brain and get disagreement on the answer. So if your brain is split, who is the you in this situation? From the outside, it's tempting to think of the part of the brain that's speaking as the person, but something is hearing and answering questions. And the right brain can't speak, it does understand faces, which left brain can't. If this is you, you don't know who your friends and family are in a crowd. This act of cutting exposes two minds in one head, and the talking mind doesn't know there's someone else in the house. The left brain can describe the situation it's in, but nonetheless will constantly be surprised by right brain's actions and explain them away. There's a question to be asked here. Why, after separation, does right brain not totally freak out, but instead plays along helpfully, answering questions and listening to left brain's dumb stories about what's happening? It's the best pony? I don't know. Speculation time, but one answer is the cutting doesn't make right brain a separate intelligence, consciousness, person, but rather it has always been. In normal people, perhaps right brain grows up as a companion without a choice, feeling at first somewhat equal partners, but then as speech develops that it can't participate in, that increasingly becomes the central point of life, it resigns to mutely coordinate with left brain. At this moment in your normal head, there are two of you watching this video. One having a mind equals blown moment and the other mentally rolling its eye at the obviousness of it all. In split brains, right doesn't freak out because not a whole lot has really changed. You might not agree and may be arguing right now why it can't be possible. Exactly as we would expect talking left brain to do. Speculation aside, split brain patients show at the very least that in the mind there is a separate something that can hear and understand and respond given the right circumstances. Your brain isn't entirely yours. Who is you? You is too. But we can go deeper. You are many. The pile of meat that is your body is made up of trillions of tiny individuals that have a life of their own. So at which point do the many become one? What makes lots of tiny things you? Click here to go to our channel and watch the next part.
All right, so that's the ending of the first part.
Here.
So pretty much the beginning of this is I'm trying to set the stage in regards to factual relationships to the split of subjective experience. And I want you, it's so easy when we take out things like Jungian shadow,
Yes.
or any types of individuation, to treat it as an object, as an abstraction. What I
Yes.
would like you to do is to entertain that there are parts of your psyche as much as a subject as how you currently self-identify,
Yes.
being too submerged and being over-dominated by the intellectual system. And thus that quote of the more you try to connect with gnosis through the intellect, the more the intellect further dominates.
Right.
And thus perpetuating the problem. That all of this philosophizing really only perpetuates the problem, pretending like it's solving it.
Yes.
That is the key in regards to this issue of why all the books you study, all the understandings you accumulate will never, ever produce an authentic relationship in this kind of regard. That's why
Yes.
it is folly.
Yes.
So, how then can you actually build an organic relationship to these parts of your mind?
Yeah.
What are the ways of doing as opposed to understanding?
Yeah.
So that all the different parts of your psyche that are otherwise submerged, fragmentary, immature, or of simply getting in the way of where you would consciously focus. Why is there inner turmoil and war?
Yes.
And to me, there's been systems all throughout the world that have dealt with this directly. It's just Western empirical as well as of enlightenment-based philosophy ignores them completely, utterly, and completely. And so my appeal in this very short period of time is to try to illuminate what is so often ignored and cast aside as being highly relevant to
Yes.
the personal experience of the depth of your individualized soul. So it's not simply about finding truth, but revealing that which already is,
Right.
because of the current states of conditioned tunnel vision that have been related by these types of thought, however, of pure in motivation. So pretty much the next video I'm going to quickly have. Unfortunately, this is a very short period of time, but I'm going to do my best. So the next I'm going to bring on Joseph Campbell. Now,
Nice.
here is going to be an example of how this sort of split can play out in one context, given natural human religion and spirituality, and how it relates in regards to the maturation of the self.
Lovely. Shall I?
Please.
All right, let's share the screen again. And we'll maximize this so that it fills the screen. There we go. And let's hit play.
Remember, Alan Watts once asked me, Joe, what is your yoga? I said, my yoga is underlining sentences. And everything I know, Will Rogers used to say, all I know is what I read in the newspapers, and all I know is what I read in books. A little more added. The rituals of initiation of young men in some of the very simple societies are extremely interesting. The boys are brought up to be in fear of the masks that the men wear in their rituals. These are the gods. These are the personifications of the powers that structure the society. The boy, when he gets to be more than his mother can handle, the men come in with their masks or whatever their costume is, and they grab the kid, and he thinks he's been taken by the gods. Taken out into the men's ground, and he's beaten up and everything else. But then there, in New Guinea, there's a wonderful, wonderful event where this poor kid has to stand up and fight a man with a mask. I'd say he's fighting the god. The man lets the kid win, takes the mask off, puts it on the kid.
Yeah.
Now, the mask is not there defeated and simply said, oh, this is just myth. Said the mask represents the power that is shaping the society and has shaped you, and now you are a representative of that power. That's a big story. And there are quite a number of examples around the world. Down in Tierra del Fuego, the Ona people down there had rituals of this kind where the kid had to get up and fight this god power that he'd always been afraid of. And the man put up a good fight, kid, you know, but then the boy won. Now you're a man. You've broken past the image as fact and understand the image as metaphor. And you are to represent what the metaphor stands for. Well, the burial isn't as important as the kid thinking he's dead. Again, these bull roarers, you know, the whoo, 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 this is the voice of the deity. Again, in New Guinea, there's a ritual where the kid is, his eyes are covered by the initiating man, and the bull roarer comes over and he tells him, now the demon, dragon, grandpa is coming to eat you. He thinks he's a goner. That's the Liebestod idea that Wagner handles, you see. You think you're dead and bing, you've broken past it. You've got a new expanded life. You're bigger. What has died has been the infantile ego. We, until we're pretty well along, 12, 13, 14, are utterly dependent on our parents and on our society. So a psychology of dependency is developed. A psychology of submission, asking for approval, expecting reproof, and all this sort of thing. But how are we going to break out of that psychological bondage into self-responsible authority, courage for what our thoughts are on our life? This is the problem of killing the infantile ego, which is one of dependency, and coming into the mature ego of authority. I always say that if you're going to go through for your PhD, you're in the dependency position until you're 35 or 40 and may never get out of it. You can judge by the number of footnotes a scholar applies as to whether he's got authority or is always simply hoping that somebody will feel that he has the right authorities. It's an important, a sensitive point in the academic world. It's impressed me, you know, you see on TV, professor is asked a question and he hums and he's trying to get the answer out straight and so forth. And then some big league baseball player is asked a question. Boy, what authority. He's not humming and hawing. He comes out, he knows he was an authority from the time he was playing ball on the sandlots. He's not asking anybody for approval. He's telling it. And this is the breakthrough to maturity that is required in the life of the adult.
All right, so pretty much before the last video set, there's an exercise and sort of affirming I want to do with the connection of these two videos. Now, this idea of entertaining this idea that it's through symbols that we can non-intellectually, through imagination, relate to the other aspects of our psyche so that there can be an actual dialogue. Now, in the West, especially in our culture, there's that fear of insanity, that fear of schizophrenia, that fear of multiple personality disorder that keeps people trapped within an intellectual paradigm because they don't want to imagine. Because if they start imagining, they will start entertaining there's subjects outside of the one dominant voice they develop. The truth of the matter is, at least within this context, every single voice that you experience within yourself to the depths of your dreams are still you, just different parts than what you identify with currently as a sense of self.
Right.
And we use different gods, the image, the personifications different cultures have of relating states of consciousness that are outside of the individual, that are outside of the normal secular society, that we get to connect with them, the intelligences that are perhaps, a foundation of this very universe and not just necessarily to mind. Now, every culture has their own ways of relating to these, what nature is, what a warlike mentality is, what does a lover look like. We can go into Jungian archetypes, if that's easier, but it's still even get greater than that because they're not about ideas, but about qualities of experience and how we map them out not so that we can focus on the map, but we're able to then navigate all the different states of mind, all the different states of consciousness, all the different states of your heart that you could theoretically enter outside of the normal framework of what you have the small little islands that you develop based on your little lives.
Right.
So we have ritual, we have methods, we have all these different ways in order to explore the potential boundaries of consciousness, because it theoretically might indeed be infinite. So in that infinite ocean, you may believe that there's only chaos in regards to all of these fragments that may spill out to you, all these cliches, all these fears, all these nonsensical. And it's about trusting this idea that by going out there, you will discover other islands of stability, other islands of sanity that are outside of the cultural conditioning. But most people don't do it because they don't have a guidance or language in order to make such a journey without the fear of what it means to fail.
Right.
So pretty much this idea of what I think of, so there's a particular line from the occultist Diane Fortune that I would like to introduce because I think it's a completely different worldview. And her idea, let's see if I want to get it exactly, so I had it up, but I had it, but I'll paraphrase. It's this idea that the imagery within, say, for example, occultism, is not meant to be descriptive of truth, but symbolic.
Yes.
The point of where it's not meant to inform the mind. It's not meant to give knowledge. It's meant to train the flexibility of your imagination so that it has the plasticity to entertain all sorts of ranges of conceptualizations.
Right.
So that you are able to have a handle, a grasp of ideas that are so dynamic and so alive that you don't need to ossify them. You don't need to freeze them. You don't need to crystallize them into something that is unmoving. That your own subjectivity and the different aspects of the other subjective parts of yourself, you can have a dynamic relationship to them, not from subject to object, but subject to subject.
Right.
Just likewise that we use symbols of language in order to connect with each other as subject to subject. So you can use symbols to connect some parts of your subjectivity to other parts of your subjectivity. It is through the stories, the symbology that we have that builds up the framework of the narratives of which we build our intellectual capacities, our orientations. So pretty much the final video, because gosh, so little time. Yes, I would like you to bring up the final video. This is from Richard Feynman. In talking about relationship to let's see, how do I contextualize quickly about the aspect, the importance of why, the why, which is the story builder, the why that relates to perspective and bias of perspective, and how that relates from gnosis, the ability to experience something and exchanging it for knowledge, exchanging it for a product. So,
okay, let me share the screen. All right, and let me full screen this. And here we go.
If you get hold of two magnets and you push them, you can feel this pushing between them. Turn it around the other way and they slam together. Now, what is it, the feeling between those two magnets?
What do you mean, what's the feeling between the two magnets?
There's something there, isn't there? I mean, the sensation is that there's something there when you push these two magnets together.
Listen to my question. What is the meaning when you say that there's a feeling? Of course you feel it. Now, what do you want to know?
What I want to know is what's going on between these two bits of metal.
Magnets repel each other.
And well, then what does that mean, or why are they doing that, or how are they doing it?
You're asking.
I must say, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question.
Of course, it's a reason. It's an excellent question. Okay. But the problem that you're asking, you see, when you ask why something happens, how does a person answer why something happens? For example, Aunt Minnie is in a hospital. Why? Because she went out and she slipped on the ice and broke her hip. That satisfies it, people. It satisfies, but it wouldn't satisfy someone who came from another planet, knew nothing about things. First, you understand why. When you break your hip, do you go to the hospital? How do you get to the hospital when the hip was broken? Well, because her husband, seeing that she had the hip was broken, called the hospital up and sent somebody to get her. All that is understood by people. And when you explain a why, you have to be in some framework that you allow something to be true. Otherwise, you're perpetually asking why. Why did the husband call up the hospital? Because husband is interested in his wife's welfare. Not always. Some husbands aren't interested in their wife's welfare when they're drunk and they're angry. And so you begin to get a very interesting understanding of the world and all its complications. In order to if you try to follow anything up, you go deeper and deeper in various directions. If, for example, you could go, well, why did she slip on the ice? Well, ice is slippery. Everybody knows that, no problem. But you ask, why is ice slippery?
Yeah.
That's kind of curious. Ice is extremely slippery. It's very interesting. You say, how does it work? You could, so you could either say, I'm satisfied that you've answered me, ice is slippery, that explains it. Or you could go on and say, why is ice slippery? And then you're involved with something, because there aren't many things as slippery as ice. It's very hard to get greasy stuff, but that's sort of wet and slimy. But a solid that's so slippery, because it is in the case of ice that when you stand on it, they say, momentarily the pressure melts the ice a little bit, so you got a sort of instantaneous water surface on which you're slipping. Why on ice and not on other things? Because ice expands water expands when it freezes, so the pressure tries to undo the expansion and melts it. It's capable of melting it, but other substances contract when they're freezing, and when you push them, they're just satisfied to be solid. Why does water expand when it freezes and other substances don't expand when they freeze? All right, I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling you how difficult the why question is. You have to know what it is that you're permitted to understand and allow to be understood and known, and what it is you're not. You'll notice in this example that the more I ask why, it gets interesting after. That's my idea, that the deeper a thing is, the more interesting it is. And we could even go further and say, why did she fall down when she slipped? That has to do with gravity. It involves in all the planets and everything else. Never mind. It goes on and on. Now, when you ask, for example, why two magnets repel, there are many different levels. It depends on whether you're a student of physics or an ordinary person that doesn't know anything or not. If you're somebody who doesn't know anything at all about it, all I can say is that there's a magnetic force that makes them repel, and that you're feeling that force. You say, but that's very strange, because I don't feel kind of force like that in other circumstances. When you turn them the other way, they attract. There's a very analogous force, electrical force, which is the same kind of a question. And you say, that's also very weird. But you're not at all disturbed by the fact that when you put your hand on the chair, it pushes you back. But we found out by looking at it that that's the same force, as a matter of fact. The electrical force, not magnetic exactly in that case, but it's the same electrical repulsions that are involved in keeping your finger away from the chair, because everything's made out of its electrical forces in microscopic details. There's other forces involved, but this is connected to electrical forces. It turns out that the magnetic and the electric force with which I wish to explain these things, this repulsion in the first place, is what ultimately is the deeper thing that we have to start, that we can start with, to explain many other things that looked like they were, everybody would just accept them. You know, you can't put your hand through the chair, that's taken for granted. But that you can't put your hand through the chair when looked at more closely, why? It involves these same repulsive forces that appear in magnets. The situation you then have to explain is why in magnets it goes over a bigger distance than in ordinarily. And there it has to do with the fact that in iron, all the electrons are spinning in the same direction. They all get lined up, and they magnify the effect of the force until it's large enough at a distance that you can feel it. But it's a force which is present all the time and very common, and is in a basic force of almost, I mean, I can go a little further back if I were more technical, but at an early level, I just have to tell you, that's going to be one of the things you'll just have to take as an element in the world, the existence of magnetic repulsion or electrical attraction, magnetic attraction. I can't explain that attraction in terms of anything else that's familiar to you. for example, if we say the magnets attract like as if they were connected by rubber bands, I would be cheating you because they're not connected by rubber bands. I shouldn't be in trouble. You soon ask me about the nature of the band. And secondly, if you were curious enough, you'd ask me why rubber bands tend to pull back together again. And I would end up explaining that in terms of electrical forces, which are the very things that I'm trying to use the rubber bands to explain. So I have cheated very badly, you see. So I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to why magnets attract each other, except to tell you that they do. And to tell you that that's one of the elements in the world of the different kinds of forces. There are electrical forces, magnetic forces, gravitational forces, and others. And those are some of the parts. If you were a student, you'd go further. I could go further. I could tell you that the magnetic forces are related to the electrical forces very intimately. That our relationship between the gravity forces and electrical forces remains unknown, and so on. But I really can't do a good job, any job, of explaining magnetic force in terms of something else that you're more familiar with, because I don't understand it in terms of anything else that you're more familiar with.
So they're pretty much, I have only a little bit of time left. It's the idea that there's so much things that are that cannot be understood because there's nothing familiarity. You have to have different experiences, things that you haven't had experience with in order to actually have a relationship with. The beginning of which is to open up the imagination to all the different range of potential experiences that are outside of your normal stabilized sense of self. So I'm going to end with a poem that pretty much what I would like all of you to do. Please, it's not about understanding the poem. I would like you to visualize, experience, and feel it within the context of taking for granted the idea that the self is not mono. So the characters of this poem are both you, at least within the context of how this poet has described it. So now I would like everyone to close their eyes as I read this poem, and please visualize it in your mind with each line and have a personal relationship with it. In the desert, I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who, squatting upon the ground, held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, "Is it good, friend?" "It is bitter. Bitter," he answered. "But I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart." Focus on how it felt. Focus on the experience of your relationship to the creature as just as much of a subject as yourself. Don't look for meaning beyond that. Feel in your heart whatever reactions you had to the creature. That is the quality. That is the impression that doesn't need to be translated, that doesn't need to be understood. And that is the end.
Thank you, Peter. These were excellent choices. I love what you've selected here. I think, this is a group to whom the split nature of the mind is less shocking, but it's still shocking to see it stated so bluntly, with the description of the experimental evidence of what it's like to experience having the corpus callosum split, having your left hand do things and you don't know why it did it. So your right brain makes up a reason. It's like that we can sense what that feels like. And in sensing that, it puts us a little bit closer to sensing what our ordinary everyday life is like. Because normally that thing is going on all the time. But because it's familiar, we've learned not to feel it.
Yes.
This is Hegel's description of the trap we're in. Anything that's too familiar, we stop seeing it for what it really is. And it's only when we can make it strange again and new that we get closer back to what it truly is.
That is why poetry is always here, but unpopular nowadays.
Yes.
Because because movies have replaced imagery.
Yes.
You to read poems that are not about an idea, but an aesthetic experience, and that helps stimulate the vividness of imagination and relationship to all, using that as the doorway to connect all the different aspects of self, so that there is that visceral aliveness and the great diversity of it that doesn't need to be triggered by external events.
Right. Right. Yeah. There's an example of the kind of context switching is the way that we've all been taught that the brain is a computer and that it stores information the same way a computer stores information. And the one thing that we know is about the brain and memory and how it works is that that's absolutely false. The brain absolutely does not work that way at all. That's just a Verstand noetic, finite, systematized, satisfying to Verstand way of modeling what it's like to be a person. And what it's more like to be a person is that we perform memories. We re-experience memories. We go back to the time and place and we immerse ourselves in it again. Our gnosis, you know, like you're talking about the experience and not saying it, not putting it into words, but feeling what it's like to be there, it appears to be fundamental to the mechanism of human memory, that we go back inside ourselves and feel it again and role play it again, and we're living it again. And that's how the information, as we so noetically call it, that's how the information returns to us, is we're there again in a way. And that's that although that may be true, that is not a description of the human mind that the modern world is going to like at all, because it's not mechanical enough, it's not logical enough, it's not rational, it's not data driven, it's not fact driven. The idea that everything that we think we know is dependent upon this irrational, unconscious, experiential half of our mind is deeply alarming to somebody who's put all their value into being finite and rational. So
it's so true, Rick. What you're just saying I agree with you. It is very true. From my own experience of how I keep having these memories of moments in my life. So true what you're saying. Yeah.
So yeah, well, we're going to have to reflect on this and how we want to weave the kinds of things you're talking about into these seminars going forward. Peter, I thought that was a very powerful half hour.
I did the best I could within a half hour.
Well, I don't think this is going to be the last time we do this. It was very experiential, and that added a gnosic quality that's been missing from the way I've been talking about Kenneth Smith's work. It's vital to it. I mean, Nietzsche without vitality, Kenneth Smith without immersion and gnosis is, as you say, it's recreating the problem instead of solving it. So I want us to come back to this. I'm going to call on Phil before we wrap up because he's had his hand up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think the experiment was good, but I thought, to me at least, my experience was incomplete because I totally translated it to my own experience, but I felt that in order to complete it, I need to translate it back to, I presume it's a scorpion. I mean, so therefore, in a sense, I wonder whether that is like still retained in my personalness, my ego, rather than in a sense, because that still treats the other, even though I have a kind of connection, it didn't seem to have created the loop that was necessary for me, at least in this short span. Now, maybe if things lasted longer, I would fulfill the completion. But in this short poem that it was, I felt that it was only one directional, and I felt that I needed to go back the other way as well.
It was a small taste.
Yeah.
I had a 3-hour long conversation with Joe, and I was finally able to sequentially put all the pieces together in order to triangulate what I was trying to get across.
Nice.
What I had in this brief period was simply trying to open the door a crack, which often generally isn't enough, but it's still that possibility of what does it mean to treat yourself as a subject from multiple perspectives, so that there is that humanness, name, as you call me Peter, but yet I'm a subject.
Yes.
To have words being just of a medium to relate to another subject, and to relate that to different aspects of yourself.
Well, my thought is that if in my situation, I'm only speculating, it was a matter of the short length of time, it seems to me it is possible for it to just merely stop at incorporating it to oneself. And so that's all I'm saying. So I need that to be more immersed in the situation for that completion to take place. And I'm not sure. Maybe I'm one of those people that never really return it. So I'm not sure whether it was the time span or whether it was my own incapability. But
I don't believe you. I think it's this. I am very certain that doing this in a group is the weakest form of it. I would need to talk with you for about an hour or more directly in order to help guide you to where I'm trying to, this specific place, this specific kind of potential. Because this is, I have to navigate all through all these different conditionings and all these different potholes that things can easily get stuck in based on the intellectual habits. This is something that it's surgery. I'm really.
So Peter,
yes,
I would be the first one to sign up for that hour, because I appreciate infinity, but I know the best way to deal with it is to navigate it.
Mm-hmm.
Uncertainty is a fact of life, and I certainly hear all of those things, and I appreciate your experiment on the corpus callosectomy, and people manifest that thing. Some people are born without it, and sometimes we transect it, right? And people behave very differently, and the thing that's most affected is speech and memory.
Right.
Behavior is a smorgasbord, right? So, and that's infinity. It's not finite. And that for me is the beauty of it.
Yeah.
And
I think, I agree with you, Sharon. I think Peter should start a new meetup.
It's the beauty of being alive. And one of the things, and Rick helps me with this sometimes, is I'm extremely left-brained, and the varying dimensions of philosophy sometimes is puzzling to me, because I come from a very finite world.
Yeah.
So that's, excuse me?
Lots of metrics.
Yes, it's metrics, it's outcomes, it's definitive.
Yeah.
Because the finitude is necessary in my world for preservation. And so I find this all very interesting.
Yes. Well, what we might do, if Peter is game, is we might repeat this in different ways, in different sessions, and sort of make it a recurring theme. Because I agree with Peter that trying to explore Kenneth Smith's philosophy in a strictly noetic way without any gnosis is a betrayal of the philosophy. And I like the door you've opened here. I'd like to explore this with you and do more of this together. If you're game.
Yeah, would love to.
Because and in the same way, I kind of want to lay my hands on more of Kenneth Smith's art and present that in some of these, and some of Phil's art, and also he has 2 books of parables that are more like the experiment that you did, where they're images and feelings, designed to do what you're doing. And I'd like to maybe start bringing some of those into these as well, as a way again to sort of appeal to gnosis and let that mute experiential part of the brain get more involved, so that the left brain can go, wait, what now? It needs to be shaken up some, right? So we can explore together how to do that. I'm going to call on Donald before we close, so don't worry, Donald, I'm not cutting you out. But for next week, we are done with Mythos and Logos. We've made it to the end of this book. It was the other books won't take as long because we had to bring a lot of material from other philosophers in and a lot of framework. At least that's my prediction. The next one, based on what we talked about, would be Millennia and Microcosm, which is an actual book. It's not just some essays that David and I selected. And it's from a column that he did for the Comics Journal that attempts to talk about the 3 epochs of European history as they relate to character and culture and modes of thought and so forth. And he uses, in that, among other things, he does a deep dive into the ancient world that will give us more of a taste of mythos culture. Because
will you send out the reading material early?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
without it, I'm lost.
Yes, this will be a change from what we've been doing for months. Is we'll be putting the material out.
Just a brief comment. We're never going to be finished with Mythos and Logos.
It's true, right?
I
This
agree,
team will go
Phil.
through
We
everything.
live it every day. I agree, 100%.
Yes, that's right. So, maybe next week we start with the essay, the first chapter of Millennium Microcosm, as just a place to get started. It'll probably take more than one session per chapter. And so maybe what we do is, after our first initial exposure to the essay next week, Peter and I, we can talk about what else we want to bring to the subsequent weeks about that one, and maybe follow that pattern with each one, where we're sort of seeing how do we make this a more Nozick experience. I really liked what you did there.
Yeah, it helps grow my right brain.
Oh,
So I
right.
liked it.
Yeah, so maybe we'll plan for that. So I hope in the next couple of days to get the first one typeset and ready for you guys, and I'll work with David to get it posted, and we'll.
Okay, thank you.
So
The
that'll be
honor
fun.
now, before we go.
And then the other thing that I have to say is a week from Friday, on October 8th, from 8:30 to, is it 8:30 to 10:30? 8:30, yeah, 8:30 to 10:30 Pacific time in the evening. So it's going to be late for East Coast people. I'm doing a introduction to Kenneth Smith's philosophy seminar for a group in Australia, which is why it's at the hour that it's at. And it'll be here through Meetup. And it will be the first time in my life I've ever attempted to summarize the philosophy of Kenneth Smith. So we'll see whether Peter's faith in my ability to represent Kenneth Smith holds as well to an overview as it does to little details of a book. I have certain anxieties about it, but I think it will be a lot of fun for anyone who wants to come. And,
You'd be awesome. Are you going to post that on Meetup? Or yes, will you be posting that on Meetup so I could see it?
The invite is already there up on Meetup.
Okay.
And
October the 8th, did you say?
it is.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes. So that's coming up, and that's obviously relevant to what we're doing here. This is also going to be the first time I've ever done a Kenneth Smith thing outside of the Monday timeframe. David's
You will
always
be
inviting me
superb.
for things.
And Rick, did you say it's 8:30 Pacific time or?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh my.
So it'll be late for East Coast people, no question. But I think David will end up posting it on YouTube too. So, but if you want to participate, then you'll want to be there at the time that it happens. So with that, as our ostensible plan for next Monday and for the Friday after that, I guess I should call on Donald because he's got his hand up. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, I just think on behalf of Hegel and Kenneth, I should ask, what does the fact that when we sever this connection between the two hemispheres, that we get this failure mode? What is the mind that when we inflict these various things on it, it fails in these ways?
Yes.
And there are not others. There's like really good book. A.R. Luria is a Russian neurologist who treated victims with head wounds in the Russian army called, I think, The Mind of the Hypnotist, where he's got the mind fails in all kinds of ways. Well, but that means the mind has some structure that we can go back to from these failure modes. And that would be, I think, Hegel and perhaps Kenneth's question. What did we learn about the mind? Not that it behaves bizarrely when we do this surgery, but
Yes.
what does it tell us about its internal structure and the way that it works?
The smorgasbord, and the mind is the one reference in the body for which there's no anatomical position, anatomical location.
Yes.
And that's it. That's it in a nutshell, as I experienced it.
That's right.
So,
That's right. And I suspect that that's part of what's so interesting about the experiment of severing the corpus callosum is that it manifests the otherwise invisible dialogue between the hemispheres in a way that actually shows up with physical behavior. And it's part of why it's so shocking to us to see it manifested, as we're so familiar with it. We don't know what's going on until suddenly our left hand slaps the selection out of our right hand. And we're going, what? This is not something I've ever, what the hell? And then, once you've seen that and once you let it totally soak in, you start going over your own life, right? And thinking, have there been times when even without a severed corpus callosum, the two have manifested behaviorally in their argument that they're having, and I just missed it?
Articulation I really like is, what does it mean when your will is divided?
Yes. Yes, that's right. What does it mean? And of course, at the end, he started to tease us with the whole, but what if there's not two? What if there's trillions of cells and they all have their own idea about what they're doing? It's like, oh no. Oh, this gets complicated. There's the
well, apparently language is so important that even when it's not restored, let's say there are people who only have remaining for the rest of their life only one hemisphere, that the other one will at least pick up part of the function, at least of language.
Yeah.
That is just not completely dismissed whatsoever. So the other hemisphere is capable of doing that one in a crunch, but it probably takes time to do that.
Right.
Oh, the neuroplasticity of the brain. That's the wonder of it all.
Yeah.
It's
Part
incredible.
of it. Yes.
I want to ground this out in one more thing, that
Yeah, shoot.
the more you use your imagination, the more you will activate neurons outside of the normal condition grooves.
Yes.
That
Well
neuroplasticity-
said. Yes. Neuroplasticity. Yes.
Learning a new language, learning a new skill, learning to dance, anything new that just goes outside the pattern. Yeah, it gets your brain going.
So, Peter, you're very young, but I can tell you I'm much older. That's part of the management of old age, staying engaged and learning new skills.
So,
Trying my best with what I got.
well, this was a blast. Thank you, everybody.
Yes. Okay.
All
See
right.
you all next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.